A simple camping trip turned into pure horror. It began as an easy plan on a Thursday afternoon, a fast message thread among 5 friends who had not seen the stars together since college. The idea sounded clean and healthy. 2 nights in the Allegheny National Forest, a site near Kinsua Creek, a little fire, a lot of silence. Then home by Sunday evening with that clear air feeling in the lungs. Nolan booked the permit number by phone, Brooke double-checked the maps, June promised a new camp stove, Priya handled food, and Malik tossed in a first aid kit heavy enough to impress a wilderness guide. Everyone liked the balance of skills and the promise of a lake nearby. Everyone wanted quiet. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? They met in Warren just before sunrise on Friday, parking under a faded light outside a diner where the coffee smelled like burnt sugar. The temperature felt crisp, cold enough to fog breath, warm enough to go without gloves. They ate in a booth that rattled when trucks rolled past. The waitress kept calling the group early birds, and the nickname stuck through the morning like a charm. At 7, the town was behind them, the radio lost signal, and the forest swallowed the road. Pines rose in tight ranks as the asphalt dwindled into dirt and the sky thinned into pale silver between branches. They drove the last hour with windows cracked for the pine smell and the sound of gravel under the tires. At 9:40, they turned off onto a narrow logging spur, followed a faded arrow marker, and bumped through standing puddles until a small clearing opened before them. The creek curved around the site like a black ribbon. A mossy boulder stood at the far edge, and birch trees leaned together as if always whispering. The place felt private and older than the dirt road. It felt like a room that had not been used for a long time and yet kept neat. They stepped out, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Boots scraping, a car door shutting, the zip of canvas. The morning went smoothly, the tents went up facing the water, the lines were tight, the flies clipped down. Priya found a flat place for the cooler. June assembled the stove and made eggs that tasted like smoke and butter. Malik stacked firewood and showed everyone a trick for dry shavings. Nolan strung a blue cord between 2 trees and hung a lantern for later. The sun climbed, a gentle, warm circle above branches. The creek moved without talking. It was the kind of peace people pay for in a city. That early to midday stretch tasted like a promise kept. Around 2, a lone pickup rolled past on the logging road and paused at the clearing entrance. The driver kept the engine idling while he looked at the group. He wore a cap, tugged low, and his profile was angular and sun-emptied. He lifted 2 fingers from the wheel in a small salute, then drove on. The moment was ordinary enough, yet the engine note lingered in the trees long after the truck was gone. Priya laughed and said the man probably knew a better spot. Nolan said all the best spots were secret. Brooke checked the map again and traced a line from the creek to the lakeshore about a quarter-mile north. She wanted to stretch her legs before dinner, and everyone agreed the light would be perfect by 4. They started that walk at 3:52. Each with a bottle of water, the trail a faint seam in leaves and needles. The forest smelled darker there, less like pine and more like a cellar. They found the lake in a shallow bowl, the surface still and metallic, catching clouds like dull coins. A thin mist drifted and peeled. In the mud near the waterline, there were shapes, not boot tread. The marks looked long and narrow, with a little crescent at the front. June crouched and pointed. Maybe deer, maybe not. The spacing felt wrong. The stride felt too careful. Priya said it looked like someone dragged a canoe. Brooke said it looked like someone crawled out, and then she laughed because that sounded like the opening line of a bad story told around a fire. Malik took a photo and tucked the worry away, the way people tuck in a shirt they plan to change later. They got back at 5:10. The clearing had changed only by feel. The light had a lower copper tilt, and the shadows had pulled together in the corners of the trees as if the woods were exhaling. They built the fire, and there was a calm, serious joy in the way flame threads rose and caught. Dinner was simple: a skillet of peppers and sausage, a pot of beans, a second pot for water. At 6:30, the fire crackled white and orange. At 7, the birds went softer. At 7:38, the cold steepened, and they put on hats. By 8, the stars switched on in sudden scattered clusters. Everything felt earned. The talk turned to old classes, to cheap apartments, to late-night walks on sidewalks far from this place. Someone joked that if a forest wanted to scare city kids, it would only need to wait until the fire burned low. Everyone laughed, and the laughter sounded warm and full, and the woods held it like a cup. At 9:50, the first odd sound rolled across the water. A single hard splash, not a fish flick, not a rock drop. A heavy body entering with weight. It came from the north side, from the shallow bowl where they had stood in the afternoon. No one moved at first. The fire hissed. Then a second splash, closer. Malik stood and lifted his headlamp. The beam found mist, nothing else. A third splash, farther to the left now, like something changed lanes. Nolan joked that it was a beaver and that beavers worked night shifts. Brooke said beavers do not move like that. Jun said the echo might be odd over still water. Priya said they should save the last of the dry wood because the damp sticks would smoke. At 10:12, a soft whistling drifted through the trees beyond the road. Not a song, not wind and grass. Just 3 notes, rising and falling in a way that felt too deliberate to be shaped by air. It did not sound near or far. It sounded like the woods were carrying it on a shoulder and setting it down among them. The fire snapped, and the 5 looked at each other. No one smiled this time. Nolan said it was probably a hunter walking out late. Malik said night hiking could be dangerous and that nobody whistles at night in a place like this. June sat closer to the fire and wrapped his hands around his knees. Priya tossed a new stick to the flames and said they should call it a night as soon as the water boiled. Brooke checked her watch and said 10:20 is a normal time to get into sleeping bags. The plan felt good because it was a plan. They bedded down at 10:49. The fire was a red bowl. The lantern swung a little in a draft and made the trees look like they moved without moving. The zip of tent doors felt too loud. Nolan and Brooke in one tent. Priya alone in the small green dome she always used. June and Malik sharing a bigger one. The night poured over everything at once, thick and cool. At 11:30, the forest settled into that heavy quiet that makes even a breath sound like a stone thrown into a lake. At 12:07, Nolan woke because the hair on his arms lifted. He heard footfalls not on the road and not on the trail, but on the soft edge of the clearing. Slow, measured, steady, like someone circling to count tents. He held his breath and felt his chest sting. Brooke lay still. The steps past his door, faded, returned on the other side. He whispered that it was probably a deer. He stopped speaking because a pale oval moved across the tent wall, as if a face passed inches away. There was no outline of a nose, there were no eyes, just a smooth stain of lighter dark sliding by. He pressed his teeth together and did not move again. At 12:40, Malik heard it too. The steps were careful and almost patient. They stopped, then a soft dragging sound, then steps again. He touched June on the shoulder, and June nodded without opening his eyes. At 1:03, the whistling returned. The same 3 notes, now shaped like a call and answer. One set from the road, one from the creek, one from the black line of trees beyond the fire ring. Priya sat up in her tent and placed her palms on the floor like she could feel the vibration. She whispered her own name as if to hold herself inside it. The notes fell quiet. Her heart did not. At 1:30, a cry lilted across the clearing, a voice that sounded soaked, thin, and cold. It asked for help without forming a real request. It carried the shape of a plea without words. It sounded like a person, and also like a tape someone had warped. Nolan unzipped an inch of the tent and looked out. Nothing but mist and a darker dark, where the creek pooled. Malik unzipped as well, and his headlamp clipped the edge of a birch. The bark looked wet like a shed skin. No eyes glowed. No bodies fled. The cry came again. From the road this time, then from the lake, then from behind his tent. The distance felt wrong each time, like it measured something that was not space. At 2, they gathered by the ember bowl of the fire and fed it just enough to make light. No one said much, breath plumed white, the lantern hummed, the whistling settled into the low trees and paced them. Brooke gripped the handle of the camp hatchet without swinging it. Priya held a long flashlight with both hands like it could double as a baton. June stood with one boot half unlaced. Malik took a deep breath and called out that they did not want trouble. The syllables fell down right where he stood, like they had weight. Nothing answered. The water shifted. The mist leaned across the ground like a fog tide. By 3, the sound slowed, as if whatever moved had lost interest. The friends returned to their tents with the brittle pride of people who had endured something and could now insist it was nothing. Sleep came in frightened scraps. When the first bleached version of sunrise slid under the treetops at 5:56, the relief tasted like clean water. They made coffee the way survivors make coffee, hands shaking, laughter a notch too loud. Daylight pushed the night backward into the tree line. It felt like being forgiven. Then they found the prints. By 7:10, the light was strong enough to peel mist off the lake, and there in the gray sand lay a sequence of marks that did not fit anything they knew. Long impressions, narrow at the front, widening mid-length, with faint lines that curved like ridges. They ran from the water to the tree line and back again. The stride was long. The path was an arc that circled the clearing twice. At one point, the marks crossed themselves in a way that suggested something had paused, crouched, and then stood. Malik measured one with his hand and said the length ran from thumb to elbow. June squinted and said it looked like something with webbed hands had walked on its fingers. Brooke said that was not how animals move. Priya said this was a bad idea made real and that they needed to leave. The vote came fast. Pack, drive out, breakfast on the road. They started at 7:31, trying to move calmly while moving fast. The tents came down in practice motions, yet the air felt wrong, as if the clearing were holding its breath. Malik reached for the lantern rope, and a wind that did not touch any leaves pushed across his neck. Nolan turned toward the creek and saw circles of ripples building where nothing had broken the surface. Brooke cinched the last strap on her pack and whispered that she could feel pressure in her ears. Priya tried her car first. The engine turned once and stopped. She tried again. Nothing but a heavy click. Jun tried his. Same click. Malik tried his. Dead. At 8:19, the whistling began again. Softer now, farther away, like the woods were practicing. Then the notes changed, lowering as if someone were walking toward a deeper room. Nolan grabbed the hatchet. Malik took the heavy flashlight. They agreed to walk the road south until they found a ridge with a phone signal. Brooke and Priya would stay with the gear and try to coax power from the portable battery. June would check the fuses. They drew a line of logic, like chalk, bright and hopeful. The south road ran along the creek and then cut up. After 10 minutes, the trees closed in and the air cooled by several degrees. At 8:49, they found the first of the old timber signs nailed to a trunk. The letters were gouged and faded. The words said no overnight use. The one below said day use only. The one below that said water level unstable. It felt like a warning whispered after the door already shut. Nolan said they did not stay by the lake, and Malik said the creek connects to the lake anyway, and that water does not respect little sign. The whistling drifted again, but now it came from ahead and behind at the same time. Nolan slowed. Malik said they should mark the trail. He tied a red bandana to a low branch and felt stupid doing it, then felt worse for not doing it sooner. At 9:12, the smell changed. Less pine, more iron. They crested a rise and saw the old iron bridge that crossed the creek where the water narrowed. The deck was banged up and patched with plywood. On the near side, something had scratched the railing with the head of a nail. Rows of tall, thin marks, grouped in threes, dragging down to the ground like someone had been bored and patient at the same time. They walked past slowly. The bridge hummed under their weight. The creek moved under them in black sliding planes. Aliquot waves licked the stones. Mid-span, Nolan looked down and saw his own face bent by the water. And then beside it, another pale oval drifting up from deeper than a person could stand. He stepped back too fast. His heel clanged against the rail, and the sound went into the trees like a thrown coin. They made it to the ridge at 9:48 and found a bar of service on Malik's phone. He dialed the ranger station number Brooke had written on a torn map corner. It rang twice and cut out. He tried again. A voicemail webbed across the line, the words too slow. He asked for help at Kinzua Creek and said they could not get their vehicles to start. He gave the coordinates the way his hand would give away secrets when it shook. Then he held the phone in the air as if that could push the message forward. He hit send. The screen blinked. The bar of service disappeared like a boy learning a magic trick. After that, the phone refused to light. They returned at 10:30, moving faster now. The clearing looked exactly the same and entirely different. The gear lay where they left it, but the cooler lid was open, though the latch was engaged. A line of wet silt lay across the ground in a curve like a resting body had left its outline. Brooke and Priya stood by the dead cars with their hands pressed flat against the hoods as if listening. June knelt by a battery with the case open and a set of fuses fanned on the ground like cards. Priya said the walk had taken too long. Brooke said a log had knocked against the stones and made them both jump. Her voice had that higher edge people carry when they have crossed from fear into the bright space where fear feels useful. Malik said the call might have gone through. The words felt weak while still true. They tried to eat at 11 because eating proves a day is normal. The food tasted like something stored in a basement that does not want to be a home. The forest had that noon silence that falls heavy on thin places. At 1, the sky turned white and then deeper gray. Nolan sharpened the hatchet with small strokes because motion felt better than stillness. Priya laid out the map and traced a route that would cut across to an old service road by late afternoon. Brooke argued they should not split again. June whispered that he could hear water under the ground as if the creek was also above them. Malik said everyone would stay together if they walked, and the rule felt like a rope. At 2, the light began to behave like late day. It was not late day. It only looked like it. Clouds slid in without wind. The whistling did not come back. The relief made them feel bold in the wrong way. They decided to move. Backpacks on, lantern stuffed into the top of a bag, a single car key in each pocket because superstition sometimes gets promoted to policy. They stepped onto the trail at 2:20 and felt that strange tilt of land found in old saloons and strange hallways. The forest was not flat. The forest was not honest either. They did not make it to the service road. At 3, the trail vanished without warning in a stand of young pines. The needle floor pressed smooth like a swept church. They spread out to find the worn line again, calling names in low voices. Malik called for Priya and heard his voice return from the right, though he had spoken to the left. Nolan called for Brooke and heard the name slide away as if the trees were carrying it. June said he saw the blue flash of the lantern cord. He did not. He saw a strip of something bright hanging from a lower branch, and when he reached it, he found his own red bandana tied tight, smelling faintly of his pocket and something muddy. They had looped back without a corner in the path. At 3:30, they were in the clearing again, though. None of them had turned their bodies. It was as if the clearing had stepped forward to greet them. The fire ring sat black and clean. The cars hunched. The lake beyond the trees lifted mist that now lay across the ground in thin belts. Brooke started to cry and did not apologize. Malik pressed his palms to his eyes and counted to 10. Nolan said they would make a bigger fire before dark, and the work would keep their minds steady. Priya sat on her pack and listened for the whistling. The silence was worse. They built the tallest legal fire and then built it taller. At 5:10, flames jumped high enough to paint the birch trunks gold. At 5:40, something moved in that painted world at the edge of the light. Not a person, not a deer. Tall and thin as a drawn line, it shifted between 2 trees and seemed to bend when it did not bend. The shape stopped, then a second shape crossed behind it in the other direction. Nolan went still in a way that makes animals forget there is meat in you. June whispered that if they made noise, it might announce them. Brooke whispered that silence had already done that job. At 6, the crying came back. That same soaked and thin sound. It asked for help from the road, then from the creek, then from beside the lantern rope. They stood together because loneliness would have ended them. The fire felt like a fragile wall. The voices drew close, then stopped, as if testing their own boundaries. Malik lifted the heavy flashlight and said with complete calm that they would hold this line until dawn. He said it loudly enough to convince his own nerves that they could obey him. At 7, the mist thickened. It rose from the creek and slid along the ground at knee height, seeping into the clearing rather than blowing in. It smelled like coins and old wood. The firelight turned it into a living thing. The shapes at the edge of the trees stepped nearer, then paused, then nearer again. Nolan saw one limb bend the wrong way like a hinge on the outside of a door. Priya pressed her back against Malik and kept the beam of her light at waist level because the space above the waist felt like an invitation. June put another log on the fire and said the fuel would run out by 11 if they fed it at this rate. Brooke said 11 was a number that felt very far away and that they would find a way to stretch the pile like poor people stretch soup. At 8:19, the first voice behind them spoke. It said Nolan in a perfect copy of Brooke's cadence, but Brooke was standing in front of him holding the hatchet. He kept his face still. It said Malik in a ribbon of Priya's voice, but Priya did not open her mouth. It said June with the soft laugh Malik used on lucky days. The edge of the clearing seemed to press in with each name, as if a roll call might replace a boundary. The fire popped and threw an ember that died before it landed. The dark became a muscle. Then the water erupted. A heavy strike on the lake surface, then another, like bodies leaping and falling and leaping again. The sound hammered at the air and drove birds from trees they had not seen. The friends did not turn. They held the circle like a small city. The splashing stopped, as if it had only wanted to prove that it could become louder whenever it liked. At 9, the lantern burned steady. The fire had slumped and revived and slumped again. The gear near the cars had taken on a glitter of damp. On the ground by the cooler lay a track like the ones at the lake, except deeper, except smeared with silt, pushed up in a thin fringe like gills. Nolan knew that if he followed that mark with his eyes, it would lead out of the clearing toward the creek, and he knew that if he looked up, he would see something looking back from that place. So he did not look up. He looked at the base of the birch instead and counted the curls in the bark. 1, 2, 3. He discovered that counting does not work on fear when the numbers have nothing to hold. At 10:11, the whistling bloomed again, and it was inside the clearing now. It came from the line where their boots stood. It came from the space under the folding table. It came from the thin place between two logs. Each time it rose, their minds tried to place a mouth under it and failed. Priya began to pray in a way that had no words. Malik placed the flashlight on the ground and rested his hand on the top as if it were a sleeping dog. June whispered that the battery was getting warm, and that meant nothing, he understood. Brooke steadied the hatchet against her leg and told the space in front of her that it was not welcome. Her voice did not shake. That mattered. At 11, the woodpile turned small. The sky above the mist had that black depth that looks like it can fold down and make a new ceiling over everything. The shapes at the edge of the clearing had grown more confident. They leaned against the light and let it reveal them wrong, limbs too long, heads without the geometry of a face. Sometimes a flat white oval hung where the idea of a face should go. The oval turned and turned like a coin on a table. Occasionally, a mouth appeared and stretched in a grin that did not reach any eyes, and then slid away as if the skin did not know how to hold it. At 11:42, something stepped into the clearing. Not far, just one step over the line where the mist met the firelight. It bent a little like a person considering how they might walk in an unfamiliar room. It lifted an arm that had an extra hinge. It held a shape at the end of that arm. It was a glove, Priya's glove, the one she had dropped near the cooler at noon. The thing let the glove fall. It listened to it fall. Then it retreated in one precise movement as if the glove had been enough to say a word. Midnight arrived without being announced. The night air had a physical weight. Each of them had made a small private promise in their head, and none of those promises sounded sane. Then a new sound climbed out of the trees. Footsteps, but not on the ground. Footsteps on wood. a slow, heavy rhythm, like someone climbing a set of stairs that did not exist. The sound moved down, and then down again, and then down once more. It came to rest at a place where there was no place. The whistling followed, 3 notes, lower than before, shaped like a door opening. The wind huffed once and died. Somewhere in the dark, in water they could not see, a bubble rose and burst with a small wet pop like a tiny hand breaking the surface. Nolan said they had to break the pattern. His voice sounded older. He said the clearing was running them in circles. He walked to the lantern rope and pulled it down. He untied the lantern and hooked it to the belt of his jacket. He told the others they would walk not by the road, not by the trail, but straight line toward the ridge, past the iron bridge, no turns, no looking back, fire in view until it could not be kept in view. He was gambling on motion. He was betting his body on a compass no one could hold. They agreed because sometimes agreeing is survival. They left at 12:14, the lantern a floating sun on his hip, the fire throwing long petal shadows behind them. The mist slid over their boots like little waves. The whistling swelled with the first 10 steps and then thinned, as if it did not like them moving together. The trees arranged themselves into lanes. The trunks looked like pillars in an old building. For 20 minutes, the plan worked. The clearing did not return. The ridgeline grew as a blacker dark lifting above the usual dark. The creak noise sharpened and became directional. The group saw the sheen of the iron bridge rails through the trees. Then the lantern dimmed. Not a slow loss, a single stutter and then a new weak yellow. Nolan jostled it with his elbow. The light flared and then thinned again. Malik said they should stop to fix it. Nolan said no. Brooke said keep going because stopping had become a kind of consent. Priya began counting steps again and made it to 213. June said the air by the bridge tasted metallic. They stepped onto the deck and the wood spoke in deep chords. The creek rushed and the sound was a relief. Water that moved with purpose felt honest. Halfway across, the light failed completely. They stood in a dark so full it felt granular. The whistling started up from below the bridge, low, patient, rising with the water spray. The 3 notes repeated until repetition became a shape. Jun lifted his phone, and the screen glowed faintly from stored charge. In that smeared blue rectangle, they saw the outline of something climbing the far railing. Long, narrow, the hands finding grip where there was no grip. It moved with a certain care that said it had learned to move this way. It reached the top and unfolded. Its head turned toward the group, not with curiosity, but with the slow attention a creature uses when its hunger is old and ritual. It held something at the end of one arm, a strip of cloth, red. Jun's bandana. They ran. They did not argue first. They did not urge each other. They moved because all the stories in their muscles told them to move. The deck thudded, the whistling climbed and became very loud. The shape did not chase with speed. It only took steps that were too long and too smooth. Nolan felt breath at the back of his neck, though nothing touched him. Malik kept his hand on Priya's shoulder to keep them together. Brooke held the hatchet low, like a weight that could keep her on the path. Jun kept the phone lit and cried without sound. They made it to the other side and into the trees. The phone light flickered. The lantern gave one last weak glow like a wounded star and then died. The forest closed in again with that polite cruelty that looks like grace. The whistling fell behind, returned ahead, fell behind again, as if the woods breathed it. The group slowed because their bodies forced it. At 12:58, they stepped into a space that their brains recognized a split second before their eyes. The clearing. The cars. The fire collapsed into a black ring, the mist heavy as a blanket. They had run the shape the woods wanted. What came after belongs to the night more than to any language. There was motion at the edge of vision like fish under ice. There were names spoken in voices that existed and did not. There was the creak of wet woods somewhere overhead. There was the first pale smear of dawn at 5:31 that lifted the mist like a stagehand pulling a scrim. And there was the final splashing at the lake, heavy and rude, like a door slamming on a house you never entered. When sunlight finally touched the tops of the birches, the clearing became a normal patch of ground. It wore the morning like a disguise. A fisherman found Nolan on a dirt spur at 7:20, walking without direction with the lantern still tied to his belt. His jacket was wet to the ribs, and his lip had a split the size of a seed. He said very little on the ride into town. He said the cars would not start. He said his friends were packing. He said the woods had too many steps in it. Later, when a deputy asked him what he meant by too many steps, and he stared at the floor and said that on the second night he had counted 6 sets of footfalls when there should have been 5. And then he had counted 7, and then he had realized he could not tell whether any belonged to them anymore. He did not add more. When the search party reached the clearing that afternoon, the site looked tidy. The tents had been neatly struck, the fire ring was clean and cold. On the sand by the lake lay a set of prints that ran from water to trees and then back again. Long, narrow. With the faint suggestion of webbing near the front, no boot tread overlapped them. A glove lay near the cooler and held the blade of the camp hatchet inside it, as if a child had dressed the tool. In a birch branch at the clearing edge hung a red bandana tied in a square knot that none of the friends knew how to tie. The deputy touched it with a pencil and let it hang. The cars both started with a single turn of the key. The battery cables were snug, the fuses sat where they belonged, the radios worked. The ranger who stood near the road and listened to the creak said that sometimes a strong thermal layer will play tricks on sound. He said it the way a man says a prayer when he has lost the words of the prayer and must make new ones. A volunteer tried to laugh. No one joined. As for Malik, for Priya, for Brooke, for Jun, no one found them that weekend. Not the next one either. The search widened and then grew perfunctory and then stopped. Nolan left the county and never returned. He does not like bridges now. He does not like the sound of 3 notes whistled in a kitchen or a parking lot. He does not like a phone signal that fades during the first part of a sentence and returns during the last. He does not like the smell of coins. When the subject of camping comes up, he says there are places where silence is not empty. He says some lakes keep their own time and that the clocks humans bring with them mean nothing there. Drivers on the logging road report harmless things. A mist that hugs the ground even on warm days. A splash heard when the lake lies flat. A thin voice that sounds like a friend calling from a little way off that stops as soon as anyone answers. People are good at ignoring. People will say it is the wind. People will say it is the highway far off. People will say it is a beaver. On some nights, near the end of the long quiet, when the sky has that dark that feels like the last page of a note, a soft whistling moves between the birches. 3 notes, then 3 again. The sound circles once as if counting. It waits. It circles again. It waits longer. It does this until the first bird speaks. The sound does not travel uphill. The sound stays low to the ground where the mist lies. The sound is not for the high things. A simple camping trip turned into pure horror. That is the line a person gives a stranger at a bar to avoid the real version. The real version is this. The woods can learn your names and give them back to you with a shape you do not want to hear. The water can remember when you are alone, even if your friends stand so close their sleeves touch yours. The night can walk around your camp with borrowed legs. And when morning arrives, it can leave just enough behind to make a human mind choose to explain instead of run. If you go, and you will, because some people always go, take fire that does not depend on batteries. Tie your rope where you can see it from the corner of your eye. Refuse to answer when a voice uses your own voice to call you. Listen closely at 12:07 because that hour loves first steps. If you hear 3 notes, do not whistle back. If you see prints that do not line up with anything you know, do not take a picture like a tourist. Keep your eyes on the bark. Count only what you can hold. And when the lake is still as metal and every tree has leaned together to watch, remember that there are nights when staying is a kind of consent. Remember that water has its own doors. Remember that some places are patient. Remember that the woods around Kinswood Creek have all the time in the world. A normal drive home became a real-life nightmare. Just after 9 on a cool autumn night, the parking lot behind the hardware store in Maple Bridge lay quiet and silver under the streetlights. The town was a small place in Rook County, tucked between cornfields and dark woods, the kind of place where people waved from porches and the corner diner knew how you took your coffee. The late shift had run long. The last customer wanted a new lock and a long conversation, and by the time the receipt printed, the clerk felt the weight of the hour resting on his shoulders. His name was Miles. He was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered from hauling lumber and salt bags, calm and steady in a way that made people ask him for directions and jumper cables. He locked the back door, breathed in the clean bite of cold air, and told himself the drive home would be a straight line through the quiet. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? He slid into his sedan, a dark blue car with a worn seat and a little squeak in the steering, and checked the time on the dash, 9:12. He sent a quick text to Nora, who ran the morning shift at the bookstore near the river, then tucked the phone into the cup holder. He liked the same route every night. Cross the bridge, take County Road 17 past the water tower, follow the long curve through Pine Hollow, and then a straight shot along Old Quarry Road to his neighborhood. 2 lanes, no traffic lights, a few mailboxes so faded you could not read the numbers even in daylight. A simple drive. The radio came on with a low murmur. He set it to a soft station, something with warm voices and a piano that sounded like it was recorded in a church basement. The car hummed. The river glinted through the trees like a ribbon of graphite. A thin mist hovered just above the asphalt. Every few hundred yards, a farmhouse light glowed in the distance and then slid away behind him. Peace laid over the road like a blanket. At the start of Pine Hollow, the trees crowded in, tall and dense, their black shapes knitting together overhead. The white lines flashed beneath the hood. Miles knew each curve here by muscle memory. He knew where the pavement buckled, where the shoulder dipped, where deer liked to step out of the corn and test their luck. He drove a respectful speed. He had changed a tire at 2 in the morning once and would prefer to never repeat that event. He did not notice the dark car until the last second. It sat on the right shoulder with its hazard lights blinking, hood up, driver door open just a crack. The red flash of the hazards pulsed across the lane and painted the white guardrail a sickly shade. A purse lay on the passenger seat, scattered open like it had been turned over, lipstick rolling into a cup holder, a wallet half out, a key ring dangling. A phone was on the ground near the hinge of the open door. The interior light burned steady, a lonely little sun in an empty cabin. He lifted his foot, not quite braking, just thinking. He had stopped for people before, and he would stop again. But something about the scene pressed a thumb into his ribs. Why the phone on the ground? Why the door ajar? Why no one waving a flashlight or standing in the beams? The car itself looked wrong in a way that was hard to name. Windows dark, like there were blankets taped inside. Hood up, but no steam, no smell of oil, no scratch of tools. He coasted by and told himself he would call it in at the next rise where the cell bars were better. His chest felt tight. He passed and kept passing. The hazards pulsed behind him and then shrank and fell back into the tunnel of the trees. The mirror caught a flicker of movement. He glanced up and felt his throat seize. In the wash of his taillights, a shape unfolded from the abandoned car, too tall to be comfortable inside. It had been crouched behind the steering wheel, folded small, and now it stood in the open door and tilted as if measuring distance. Pale skin or maybe a white mask flashed once and vanished as the hazards blinked. The shape slid back down. The door closed. The hazards stopped. Miles gripped the wheel. He felt the old instinct to turn around and make it right, the same instinct that made him stop for a wandering dog or carry groceries for a stranger. The instinct wrestled with a colder voice that was saying, keep moving, call for help soon. Do not be the person who pulls over for a stage scene. The colder voice won. He pressed the accelerator. The low hills of the hollow rose and fell like a wave train. The radio turned into background static. He checked his phone. No signal. The little triangle sat empty. He lifted the device toward the windshield as if altitude might help. Nothing. He set it down and tried to breathe evenly. A white sign flashed by that warned of sharp turns. The trees pressed close again and the road narrowed. The night felt alive now, the kind of alive that made hairs stand up even under a hat. A pair of headlights appeared in the mirror, far back then closer. He told himself it was a traveler who had come up fast on the straight stretch. He told himself that people tailgate at night because they want your lights to pull them through curves. He told himself to ignore it. The headlights grew larger, bright enough to paint the outline of his back seat. The following car drifted left, then right, then dropped back like a swimmer testing a current. No passing now, not here. Miles kept his speed steady. He did not tap his brakes. He knew that tap could look like a challenge. The following car closed the distance in a quick surge. Its beam climbed the rear glass and stung his eyes. He could see the shape of a tall hood, a long windshield. He could see a dent on the front bumper on the right side. He could see a strip of black tape where a turn signal should have been. The same car. He knew it, bone deep, the way you know the shape of your own hands. His mouth went dry. The road ahead ran straight for a quarter mile before the next bend. At the end of that straight, he could see the faint comfort of a reflective mile marker and the ghostly outline of the old quarry fence. His car could handle 70 for a little while, but anything higher made the engine whine and the steering go light. He pressed the pedal and felt the floor. The following car matched him without effort. It drifted, right until its right front tire kissed the gravel on the shoulder, then snapped left again, a silent show of control that read like a threat. It fell back, then surged forward and bumped his bumper once, a shallow metal kiss that shoved his sedan forward with a hard jolt. The seatbelt cut across his chest. His teeth clicked. He corrected the wheel, breathed out through his nose, kept the lane. Another bump. Harder. A brief grind of metal. He felt a sting along his ribs as the belt bit. The road curved left here. On the right, a black drop into scrub and stone. He had helped tow someone from that ditch at noon in high summer. He had seen the gouge in the dirt that could swallow a wheel. He held the center while his heart pounded like a mallet. Up ahead, a green sign glowed, small, nothing fancy. Tucker Fuel, 3 miles, open all night. He pictured the little island of light by the highway, the gumball machine inside, the ringing bell over the door, the sign that always hung crooked over the coffee pot. He aimed himself at it like a ship aiming for a lighthouse. He kept his speed high enough to keep the space between, low enough that he could control the next curve. The pursuing car hung on his bumper, its brights flared. Miles felt the headache that comes from light burning hot inside the skull. The road leveled. The gas station sign rose up like a promise. A lone pump, a long shadow of a pickup near the side wall, a storefront with cheap blinds and shelves of antifreeze. He took the turn into the lot at a clean angle and stopped close to the door, so close that if anyone wanted his driver door, they would have to squeeze against the building. The other car slid past on the highway, slowed for 3 counts, and then poured on speed and disappeared. No plates were visible. The rear glass looked painted from the inside. The door to Tucker Fuel opened with a bell that sounded eager. The air smelled like coffee and grape soda. A woman behind the counter looked up, shock widening her eyes. Her name tag said, Marla. She wore a faded sweatshirt with a wolf on the front. Miles tried to keep his voice low, but everything came out in short reports. He told her there was a car. He told her the bumps. He told her he needed to call the sheriff. He felt like his words bounced around and did not land, like a dozen beads spinning in a cup. Marla rounded the counter without asking and walked the glass with him. She clicked the deadbolt and pulled the thin chain across the door. She pointed to the phone. He dialed. A calm voice answered at the county dispatch center and asked for location, nature of emergency, description. He gave the mile markers. He gave what he had seen. He tried to be slow and careful, but his breath kept catching. The dispatcher told him to stay inside and to keep the car where it was, nose toward the door. The dispatcher told him a deputy was already on the way from the river bridge and would arrive soon. The dispatcher told him he had done the right thing. Marla poured him coffee without asking. He wrapped his cold hands around the paper cup and stood where he could watch the road. She said he could stand in the office if he wanted. He said here was fine. A minute stretched long. The clock over the chips ticked. A truck rolled past on the highway and kept going, no trouble, just a ghost on a line. Then the red and blue lights bloomed against the glass like a sunrise. Deputy Ana Ruiz stepped out with her hat tilted low against the chill. She moved with the quick stillness of someone trained to be calm when other people are not. She examined the bumper first. The rear right corner had a scar of bare metal where paint was scraped clean, dust of blue curled like dry skin. She crouched and studied the gouge and then took pictures, each one marked by the white flash of her small camera. She asked Miles to repeat his story. He said it again, this time in a voice that sounded like the one he used at the store when he needed to explain a return policy. He heard his own words line up and tried not to think about the way his pulse was still climbing. Another unit arrived. Deputy Reed, a broad man with a radio voice that sounded like gravel. They took statements from Marla, too. She had not seen the other car, but she put her hand on the counter to show how Miles had put his hand on the counter and how cold his skin had been. Ruiz said she would sweep the highway up to the hollow. Reed would go back toward the bridge. If the car was out there, they would find it. They did not find it. Not the abandoned car, not the pursuit car, nothing. There were faint tire marks in the gravel at the place where the hazards had flashed, but the marks were confused by dozens of older tracks and the soft brush of wind. The phone that had been on the ground was gone. If it had ever been there at all, the road had swallowed it. Reed called in from the bridge with the same report. Nothing. The night had closed behind the event like a curtain. Ruiz returned to tuck her fuel and told Miles she would follow him home. She asked if he had someone waiting. He said yes, Nora, at the house near the ball field. He said he would call on the way as the bars returned. She told him to take it slow. She would stay right behind with her lights off until they reached the neighborhood. He thanked her. His gratitude came out rough and quiet. They drove, Ruiz a patient shadow in the mirror. The night felt thinner now, stretched but alive. Miles thought about the figure unfolding from the car. He thought about the way the hazards had clicked off before the pursuit began. He thought about timing and planning and how easy it would be on an empty road to play at hunting. He checked the ditches for any flicker of movement and saw only rows of cornstalks rattling like bones. At home, Nora stood on the porch in a wool jacket, hair tied up in a knot that meant she was tired and annoyed and worried at the same time. A porch light made her face look pale and strong. She took one look at the bumper and swore under her breath. Ruiz spoke to them both. The deputy was careful not to tell them stories. She said there had been reports in neighboring counties of staged breakdowns, cars waiting for good Samaritans, people who had been forced to the shoulder by nudges and then robbed, sometimes just robberies, sometimes worse. She told them to keep the car in the garage if they could, to call if any unfamiliar vehicle idled at the corner for more than a minute, to save the shirt Miles had worn in case residue could be lifted from the fiber. Ruiz did not raise her voice. She spent 20 minutes making sure they had the number to the direct line. Then she left, slowed down the block, pausing once to look back, as if to let the neighborhood know someone was watching. In the morning, Miles noticed a tiny black scuff under the trunk lip. It looked like gum, but felt like hard plastic. He pried it with a flathead screwdriver, and a small rectangular magnet came loose, stuck to a plastic shell no bigger than a matchbox. The device clattered onto the driveway. Inside was a battery and a little printed board with a chipped corner. He had seen trackers online at the store when he stocked the shelves. Not the same brand, but the same shape and use. He took a photo and texted it to Deputy Ruiz with a single sentence that read, "Found this under the trunk." He waited in the kitchen with his second cup of coffee and the quiet thump of the refrigerator. The deputy called back fast. She asked him to seal the device in a sandwich bag and leave it on the porch. She told him she would swing by on her lunch hour to pick it up. She told him he had done the right thing again. He did not feel right. He felt like someone had been inside his life without permission. Work felt like play acting that day. The aisles were the same. The bell over the door made its friendly sound. He cut key blanks and hauled birdseed bags to the tailgate of a pickup. He showed a retired teacher how the garden hoses were organized by length and price. He smiled. The smile drifted. In his mind, he kept seeing the shape unfold from the car and the way the hazards went dark. He kept seeing the long windshield of the chase car and the flat blank of its rear glass. He stepped outside at lunch and stood in the sun to warm up. He listened for tires. He heard only a train on a far line. That evening, he changed his route. He told himself this was not fear. It was caution. He took River Road to the highway and looped past the outlet mall with the bright new stores and the mulch smell from the landscape beds. He made his way to the Maple Lantern Diner and sat at the counter for a bowl of chili with chopped onions and a square of cornbread. The place was cheerful and chrome bright. A man 2 stools down noticed the fresh scrape on the bumper and asked the casual question people ask when they want to hear a good story. Miles gave a simple version and watched the man's face flatten. The man was a long-haul driver who knew every turn on County Road 17. He said he had seen a car with a taped turn signal parked at the pull-off near Black Creek Bridge 2 nights before. He had seen another driver slow and then dart away. He said he had reported it to the highway patrol. He said he had not stopped. He said, "Good on you for not stopping." The weekend came, the town breathed. High school football under the lights filled Friday night with the sound of brass bands and the soft thud of running feet. Saturday morning smelled like cinnamon rolls. Miles and Nora walked the farmer market and pretended the world was as simple as the bushel baskets in front of them. He scraped the garage floor clean and made a neat line of tools and sworn off words. He thought the week had been a lesson and it was over. Sunday night proved him wrong. At 9:24, he turned from the highway onto his street. A dark sedan idled at the corner by the ball field. Its lights were off. There was no driver visible. The windows were too dark. He slowed and looked without turning his head. The car did not move. He passed, parked, and sat with the engine idle, counting to 30. The sedan rolled away as soft as a thought. No plates again, no visible stickers or dents, just the shape of a car built to vanish in plain sight. He did not sleep well. He dreamed of long lanes of white lines that ran out into corn, of doors that closed on their own, of hands under the trunk lip. He woke at 1 to the thrum of a distant engine and lay still listening. It faded. He woke again at 2 to the scrape of tires on gravel. By morning, he felt thinner at the edges, as if his skin had been sanded. On Monday, Ruiz called with an update. The tracker had no stored data that the lab could pull. The chip was cheap and anonymous. It might only have broadcast a low signal to a nearby phone. The deputy said a similar device had turned up in another case near a rest area off the highway. Nothing concrete tied the events together. She told him again to be careful and to call if anything felt wrong. He listened hard to the calm in her tone. He borrowed some of that calm and held it like a tool. The week slid by in a way that felt off balance. Twice, he noticed a dark sedan in the distance on his way home. Once at the water tower, once idling near the feed store. He kept his speed controlled and stayed under bright signs in view of cameras and curious staff. He began to think about how many cameras watched the road that saved him, and he felt grateful for their dumb glass eyes and silent patience. He stopped at Tucker Fuel every night, bought a pack of gum he did not need, and stood for a minute making conversation with Marla, who had switched from wolf sweatshirt to a shirt with a faded mountain and a hawk. Routine grew like a shield. On Thursday, a curious piece of news swept through town. The sheriff's office released a short note that asked drivers to avoid stopping for stranded vehicles on unlit 2-lane roads. The note advised pulling into the nearest lit area and calling the situation in from a safe spot. It did not mention arrests. It did not mention a car with a taped light. People read it and nodded. People told other people that you could not be too careful. On Friday, Miles found an old dash camera in a clearance bin at work. He had not wanted to become the sort of person who documented everything, but the old part of him that liked neat rows and hardware that matched said this was a small price for a quiet night. He wired it up before he clocked out and set the little lens to watch the road from the center of the windshield. The camera was not fancy, but the tiny screen showed the white lines bright and honest. Just after 9, he crossed the bridge. He stayed off County Road 17 and took the longer sweep past the mall. He slowed at a yellow light and felt his phone buzz. He did not check it. He rolled past the Maple Lantern and thought about coffee. He chose home. He turned on to Old Quarry Road and let the car settle into that friendly groan it made at 52. The world softened. He exhaled. In the mirror, a dark shape appeared. It hugged the lane divider, then moved to the right, then drifted left. It held back at a steady distance. The distance did not feel like coincidence. He could hear the hollow beat of his own pulse in his ears. He picked his landmark. 2 miles ahead, a warehouse with floodlights sat at the corner of Flint Street. There were always night staff, moving pallets. There were always cameras, bright ones that made even clean cars look guilty. He would not be chased into the woods again. He would pick a bright place and make the line of travel predictable. The dark shape moved closer. It drew up alongside for a breath, then tucked back as if performing a little test. He kept his hands at 10 and 2, felt like a student again, paid attention to his rear bumper and the space that wrapped around him like a bubble. The shape settled in behind. Its lights stayed low. It did not bump this time. It simply shadowed him in a way that said, patience. The word made the skin between his shoulders tighten. The floodlights at the warehouse bloomed white and strong. The lot lay open like a stage. A forklift crossed slow in the far lane. A worker in a neon vest stood smoking near a stack of pallets that seemed to go on forever. Miles eased into the turn lane and hit his signal. The shadow car slowed with him. He thought about pulling mid-lane and stopping hard, letting the pursuer choose. But even in imagination, the tactic felt like a risk that did not pay. He chose a simple entrance and swung into the lot. The dark sedan rolled past instead of turning. It coasted to the far side of the intersection and paused. From where Miles sat, he could see no driver, only a black interior with a hint of a pale shape. His heartbeat stopped trying to leap and settled into a heavy drum. He killed his engine and stepped out into the blast of warehouse light. The worker in the neon vest flicked his cigarette and waved. Miles waved back and felt irrational gratitude for a stranger chewing mint gum. He stood by his car for a full minute and watched the dark sedan. A long truck rolled through, diesel whispering like a river. The sedan moved again, a slow roll, then a rise of speed. It drifted away down Flint Street and dissolved into dark. Miles opened his phone and called Ruiz. She answered with a tired voice that still sounded like a shield. She told him a unit was nearby. She asked him to remain where he was. She asked if he was alone. He said he was, but the way he said it made it sound as if he was not. A patrol car eased into the lot under the glare. Ruiz stepped out. She had a look on her face that said she wished she could be 2 places at once. She stood next to him, and together they watched the road without speaking for a long stretch. She finally said they had found a vehicle 2 towns over earlier in the evening, plates that returned to a car reported wrecked in another state, interior stripped bare like a bone, windows painted on the inside, no fingerprints worth lifting. She said a neighbor in a farm lane had reported a similar vehicle last week. She said they were not alone in this. The way she said it made it sound like both a comfort and a warning. 2 more weeks passed. The nights grew colder. Nora placed a small baseball bat by the door, even though she had always made fun of people who kept weapons by the door. Miles learned to notice the pattern of his own taillights reflected in the back of delivery vans. He learned the angle that made a plate readable on a dash camera. He learned to repeat details the way dispatch wanted them. His brain felt like a filing cabinet that had been put in order by someone neat and stern. One night, near the end of that second week, the story gathered its last sharp edge. Miles had stayed late to help at the store with the first rush of holiday boxes. He left at 9:40. The town had already put up the lights that make the river look like a line drawn in sugar. He ran the long route past the mall and then cut toward the quarry because the lines there comforted him. The road was empty. At the rise near the water tower, his headlights licked over a parked car near a pull-off. The hood was up, the hazard lights flashed, the driver door sat open a little, a bag lay on the passenger seat, a phone lay on the blacktop inches from the door. Every detail was the same. Every detail was a script. His heart climbed up and tried to hide in his throat. But some other part of him, a part assembled from 13 sleepless nights and the way a tracker feels under your fingers, took control. He did not brake. He did not even slow. He drifted slightly toward the center line to give the scene a wide berth. He watched the door in the corner of his eye. A shape unfolded and stayed low. The hazards clicked off exactly as before. The dark car slipped from the pull-off and rolled out behind him like a toy pulled by a string. Miles did not run. He held 55 like a promise. He let the distance exist. He aimed for Tucker Fuel with a calm certainty that felt like a blade. He pulled into the lot and set his bumper to the glass with the exact same angle as before. Marla looked up with a face that was already moving. She reached for the phone without being asked. She kept her eyes on the road while the call went through. The dark sedan passed the station, slowed, paused, and flowed away. The bell over the door chimed like a heartbeat. Above the counter, an old black and white television crackled with a game he could not see, only the uniforms, white blur against green blur. This time, Ruiz did not go to the shoulder. She did not search the ditch. She had another unit waiting a mile down in the dark, turn that twisted before the bridge. They did not run lights. They sat quiet. When the dark sedan came around the curve, a spotlight hit it from the bank side with a clean square of hard white. The car hesitated. Reed pulled out and pinned the angle. The sedan tried to jump the shoulder. The shoulder dipped and grabbed the front tire. The car skidded and spun once and went nose first into a low ditch that stayed dry even after heavy rain. The engine screamed and then coughed. The driver door flew open and two figures ran into the scrub. They were fast. The deputies chased, but the night swallowed the shapes the way it always swallows what it wants. Back at the car, Ruiz found the windows painted inside with flat black. The interior was stripped, the rear seats were gone, there was no backplate. The front plate was the wrong number by 1 digit, a trick for any casual glance. In the trunk well, where a spare tire should sit, there was only a clean circle and a smell like rubber and glue. Nothing in the car tied to a name, nothing in the field led to a house. The tow truck took the sedan away under a tarp. Ruiz drove by the station at 2 in the morning and told Marla that the car would not be back. She told Miles that the world does not always give you a name you can hold, but sometimes it gives you the absence of a threat, and that is worth something too. She told him this would probably stop now. She told him to keep the camera running anyway. It did stop. Life retook its shape. Not quite the same, but strong. Miles went back to County Road 17 in daylight only. At night, he took the bright route and let the floodlights bless his hood. He kept a small kit in the trunk, water and flares and a blanket because planning soothed him. He talked to strangers a little less, but when he did talk, he looked them in the eye and listened until they were done. Nora teased him about his cautious roots, but her voice had that soft center that meant she approved. Sometimes he would stop by the warehouse on his way home and sit for 5 minutes watching pallets move and lights blink on and off like patient stars. Sometimes he would pull into Tucker Fuel for a coffee he did not need, and Marla would tell him about a stray cat that had adopted the dumpster, and they would stand there in the hum of the cooler and the sugar smell of donuts and admire the way a small animal can survive on a patch of asphalt if it chooses. Sometimes, on a windless night, he would drive the long curve and catch sight of the pull-off where the first scene had been arranged, and he would feel the strange mixture of gratitude and anger that lives in the chest of any person who has seen something near and ugly and survived it. In Rook County, people began to tell new stories at their kitchen tables. They told each other to drive to the light. They told each other to trust their gut. They told each other that help is real, but so are traps, and that both truths can live in the same night. They said the deputies had done good work. They said the night feels different now, but different can mean safer if you do not let fear steer the wheel. One evening in late fall, a thin rain fell, and the river ran high. Miles left the store at 9:40 again and took the bright route by habit. The dash camera winked its red light. He crossed the bridge and felt the tires roll easy on wet lines. At the warehouse corner, a long truck stood still with its hazard lights ticking. A young driver waved with both hands. Miles felt his chest tighten, then felt at ease. He pulled near, not too near, and stayed inside the car while he called the number from the sticker on the truck door. The dispatcher answered and sent a service unit. The driver put his hands up to say thank you and stayed by his cab. No one unfolded from the dark. No one bumped a bumper. A service truck arrived, and the night resumed its plain shape. Miles took a breath that went all the way down. He drove home and sat for a moment with the engine off in the driveway, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the soft, tired rain. Later that night, he stood by the kitchen sink and watched the street through the little diamond window. The porch light made a pale coin on the step. A neighbor walked a dog that wore a tiny raincoat. Somewhere down the block, a television laughed. He thought about how close a person can come to something mean without seeing its name. He thought about a simple rule that had saved him: drive to the light, and he felt a quiet swell of thanks for Marla and for Ruiz and for every forklift operator and truck driver who has ever made a parking lot bright for a stranger at the edge of panic. He turned off the light and went to bed. The house settled, the wind touched the eaves, he lay still, and he listened. The world was not safe, the world was not fair, but the world contained light, and he had seen the way it pushed back the dark when it mattered, and that memory sat in him like a small fire that would not go out. He dreamed of straight roads and morning fog that burned off quick. He dreamed of a sky the color of brushed steel. He woke just before dawn and felt steady. On the drive to work that morning, the river was a wide mirror. The sun climbed slow. The blue sedan held the lane like a faithful horse. He passed the spot near the water tower and did not look too long. He passed Tucker Fuel and waved to Marla, who had propped the door with a brick for the fresh air. He pulled into the lot behind the hardware store and sat for one last quiet moment before unlocking the back door. He looked in the mirror at his own face, older by a notch, sharper in the eyes, and he nodded once, as if to mark the change and accept it. A normal drive had become a real-life nightmare. It had also become a reminder, the kind that hurts and teaches in the same breath. He had listened to the voice that said, "Keep moving toward the light." He had learned the shape of danger on an American two-lane road. He had learned that help is often just a door and a bell and a person who looks up and cares enough to move. He had learned that some nights you choose the route with cameras and forklifts and floodlights, and that choice is not fear, that choice is wisdom. He took the keys from his pocket, felt the small weight, and went inside to start the day. Why this tape was locked away for decades is: it began with a quiet knock on a metal door just after midnight, the kind of soft, embarrassed tapping that makes a night shift officer glance up and wonder if they imagined it. The archives room at the Mill County Sheriff's Office sat at the end of a dim corridor where the vending machines hummed and the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired cicadas. Deputy Mark Doyle had the key. He'd been told to keep the door closed unless someone from records was with him, but that night, a dispatcher slid him a note that said, a homeowner on Buckhorn Road had found an old VHS tape in a box of junk taken from an estate sale. The homeowner said there were voices on it. He said the tape knew his name. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Doyle wasn't the superstitious type. He took the cardboard shoebox from the man who waited on the bench outside the bullpen, a guy who kept wringing his baseball cap and glancing toward the empty hallway like something might step into view at any second. The address on the receipt tucked in the box matched the old Hanley property out by Pine Hollow, a farmhouse everyone in the county knew for one reason or another. Teenagers dared each other to shine headlights at its hollow windows at night. Hunters used the overgrown pasture as a landmark. Years ago, a missing person search had used that house as a staging area for one long, cold week. Snow fell, search dogs whined. Nothing was resolved. Doyle carried the box into archives, flipped the light, and breathed in that dry, papery air that always smelled like stapled reports and lost time. Steel shelves marched in rows. A portable television on a wheeled cart sat in a corner beside a VCR the department kept for old evidence. He could have logged the tape and gone home. He could have sealed it, labeled it, done everything exactly by the book. Instead, the quiet got to him. The knowledge that he could dismiss a frightened man's worry with a simple, ordinary glance at ordinary static tempted him like a dare whispered in a crowded bar. He lifted the tape from the box. The plastic felt heavier than it should have, cool as if it had come from a refrigerator. Along the edge, someone had written in block letters with a thick marker, "Do not watch." Doyle smiled despite himself, that crooked grin people wear when they plan to disobey a childlike warning. He slid the cassette into the VCR, turned on the TV, and waited for snow to fill the screen, for dead air to hiss, for nothing to happen so he could shrug and clock out. The picture rolled once, twice, then steadied. A murky grayscale image formed, bleary at first, then startlingly clear. The frame showed a living room with a low ceiling and narrow windows. Lace curtains, a braided rug, a cabinet with a radio the size of a suitcase, a calendar tacked to the wall by the kitchen door, the page flipped to a month. Doyle couldn't make out because of glare from a lamp. It looked like the past, not just in the decor, but in the way the air itself seemed thick, as if the room were underwater. The timestamp in the corner was broken into nonsense, the digits dissolving and reforming like frost. No one spoke. No one walked through the frame. For a long minute, the camera just looked. Doyle leaned closer. The lens seemed to be placed at chest height near a doorway, angled slightly down, not on a tripod exactly, but on something stable. The room felt intact, clean, lived in, not abandoned. Then a sound rose, faint as breath on glass. It was not words, not yet, more like a murmur between floorboards. Doyle frowned and reached for the volume knob with a slow hand, as if a loud movement might startle whatever he was hearing. When the voices resolved, they didn't feel like actors captured on tape. They felt like people very near the microphone, speaking in low, urgent tones to a child. A man said, "Hush." A woman said, "Look at me." The child replied with a small, broken no, not like defiance, but like a plea. The camera did not turn. It stared at the empty room, and somewhere just out of frame, someone began to cry quietly. Not the chest-shaking sobs of panic, but the restrained, frightened weeping of someone trying not to be heard. Doyle's mouth went dry. He checked the box for a note, for a label, for anything that might explain what the homeowner had really brought him. He found nothing but a receipt with the estate sale address and a second piece of paper folded twice that smelled faintly, unbelievably, like storm-damp earth. On that paper, written in a narrower hand, were 4 words. "If you value sleep." The picture fluttered. The camera wasn't moving, but something in the light shifted, like the room had inhaled. Doyle touched the screen with his fingertips and felt static buzz against his skin. The lens appeared to change focus without any mechanical sound, as if it were choosing where to look. At the edge of the braided rug, a small shadow lengthened, the sort of soft, feathered shape you'd expect from a lamp. Only the lamp's shadow should have leaned away from the lamp. This one drew toward it, like something beyond the frame was changing the angle of light in a way that made no physical sense. Doyle murmured an involuntary, "Hey," and stepped back. Another voice came from off-camera, older, brittle, words like dried leaves. "You can't make it let go," it said. "Not now, not after this long." The child's small voice said something that the microphone didn't catch, and the older voice replied, "It will learn you. It always learns you." On instinct, Doyle reached for the remote. He wanted to stop it, not because of what he saw, but because of what his body felt, a faint vibration in the floor that could have been his own pulse until he realized it was syncing with the soft thump coming from the television. He hit pause. The image froze on a mid-tone gray frame. The thump continued, steady, spaced like footsteps on stairs. He ejected the tape with a shaky forefinger and pinched the cassette between the pads of his fingers as if it might sting him. He wrote an evidence label in block letters, sealed the tape in a bag, and carried it to a shelf at the very back where old burglary photos and mold-smelling diaries sat without attention. He locked the cage and told himself he'd call records in the morning, he'd call the homeowner, he'd pass this on like any other odd but harmless item. Then he turned off the lights and stood in the doorway longer than he meant to, listening with a sort of childish dread for the sound of the television clicking on by itself. It stayed dark. He laughed under his breath, a thin, embarrassed sound, and went home in the gray hour before dawn. He did not sleep. The tape might have gathered dust there if not for a flood in the basement 2 weeks later that forced the department to move stacks of files into the hallway. While shifting boxes, an archivist with a neat desk and a quiet manner named Lena Cotton saw the words on the label and felt a ripple of something she couldn't name. She had grown up near Pine Hollow. She remembered the search parties that trudged through the fields with fluorescent vests and hand warmers tucked in their gloves. She also remembered, more faintly, that her grandmother used to stop speaking when the Hanley property was mentioned, as if the house itself could overhear you. Lena did not believe in curses. She believed in chain of custody forms, in signatures that didn't smudge, in lists that balanced. Yet that night, with the basement pump whining and the fluorescent lights flickering just enough to look like blinking eyes, she rolled the VCR cart into a conference room and shut the door. She told herself she was previewing the tape so she could write an accurate synopsis for the catalog. She told herself she was saving time, saving money, saving the department another headache. She set the tape in the machine, sat on a folding chair with the back pressed to the wall, and let the screen fill a square of the dark with a light that never felt warm. This time, the picture began in the hallway of a house, the camera aimed at a narrow staircase. The steps were steep, the banister worn smooth at the places where hands had polished it through habit. The carpet runner had a faded floral pattern. Lena recognized a pattern like that from her grandmother's place, the kind of rug older relatives never threw away, no matter how frayed it became at the edges. The audio was clearer now. You could hear a radio murmuring something distant, not words, but the rise and fall of a human voice. Then the footsteps started again, that soft, measured thump. They were not coming down the stairs. They were ascending, slow, patient, pausing on every third step, like whoever was climbing had to listen before they took the next one. Lena felt it then. The slightest tremor against the soles of her shoes, as if the building itself were acknowledging the sound. She paused the tape, pushed the chair back, and stood up too quickly. The room swam. When she hit play again, the camera angle had shifted. It now looked into a small bedroom at the top of the stairs. A bedspread with a quilted ring pattern covered the mattress. A glass of water sat on a nightstand beside a neatly stacked paperback and a cloth-bound journal with an elastic band. She saw a hand near the glass, not reaching for it, but resting beside it. For a terrible second, she thought the hand was severed, alone on the table. Then she recognized the slow flex of fingers at rest. Someone sat on the edge of the bed, just out of frame. The voice of the older person returned. That brittle whisper. "Don't face it," they said. "You feed it every time you do." The child said, "What if it says my name?" The older voice waited a heartbeat, then said, "It will. It always does." You say this instead, and the sentence that followed was swallowed by a burst of static that sounded like a storm sucked through a straw. Lena's phone buzzed on the table, a small mechanical rattle that felt obscene in that room of slow dread. She let it go to voicemail, not because she wanted to keep watching, but because she felt if she cut the thread the tape had thrown into the room, something else would tug the loose end through. The camera did not move, yet the focus looked past the bedroom door into the hallway, as if the lens had decided the important thing was not the bed or the hand, but the dark mouth of the stairwell where the air looked thicker than air should. The screen cut out. The time counter on the VCR rolled forward soundlessly for several more seconds. Then an entirely new scene appeared, one that made Lena make a noise she had not made since she was a child alone in the upstairs bathroom at night. The new frame showed a different living room, one with drop ceiling tiles and a cheap shelf of binders and a corkboard with pinned memos. It took her a heartbeat to recognize that it was the very conference room she was sitting in, the camera positioned exactly where the television was now. The angle caught the folding chairs, the coffee stain near the wall, and the metal door with the scratch across it shaped like a crooked smile. The television in the frame was dark, but its screen held a smear of light in which a person could be seen faintly, as if reflected in a rain-blurred window. Lena did not want to lean closer, but she did. The person in the reflection was seated at a table. Their posture was unmistakably her own. A hand came up in the reflection and touched the side of the face. Her fingertips on her own cheek felt cool. Then the door in the granular image opened a fraction, and a shadow crossed the threshold in a way that made her stomach drop because it did not move like a person. It moved like a tilt in the frame, as if the picture had been lifted and whatever was outside had slid toward the low edge. The screen went black, the VCR clicked, and the tape stopped. Lena found that her throat hurt. She realized she had been holding her breath long enough to make her lungs ache. She waited for the childish instinct to pass, the one that told her to lift her feet onto the chair like something might be patient and low to the ground. Instead, she stood up, pulled the tape free, sealed it, labeled it again for good measure, and carried it to the furthest edge of the evidence room where she placed it, without ceremony, behind a ledger of vehicle thefts no one consulted anymore. On the outside of the cassette box, she added one more line beneath "Do Not Watch." She wrote, "Return to Hanley Box." The next small thing that shouldn't have mattered but did was a maintenance call from the property owner who'd purchased the Hanley land when the farmhouse was finally condemned and knocked down. He wanted to build a storage garage and complained the foundation behaved like a sponge. Workers poured gravel and watched it settle overnight, as if the ground had exhaled. On the second morning, one of the crew placed his thermos on a stack of lumber, stepped away, and when he returned, the thermos lay on its side with a neat wet circle beneath it, water inching toward the old footprint of the staircase. He swore he heard a radio far away, a voice he couldn't make out, speaking steadily like someone reading a forecast to a room that had no window. Word spread the way it does in small places where everybody knows everybody, not through official channels, but through murmured confessions at the end of shifts. A dispatcher named Brooks admitted he heard his own name whispered from the archives cage when he passed it on a night he knew no one was inside. A EMT said the television in the break room flickered to a local news channel that hadn't existed in years and ran a crawl with his street spelled wrong. A substitute teacher told a friend she saw a shape in the reflection of the gym office door during a lockdown drill. Not a person exactly, but a bend in the light that felt like looking down old stairs. A journalist living 2 towns over, Mallory Keene, heard the rumors when she stopped for coffee, and a man in a dusty jacket told her, with a seriousness that made her set down her cup, that there was a tape at the sheriff's office that kept finding new rooms to show. She did not laugh. She was the sort who never laughed when someone told a story that made them scared. She filed a records request for anything relating to the Hanley property, to Buckhorn Road, to a VHS cassette turned in by a resident whose name she'd been given on a napkin stained with cream. The department responded with a polite denial that said no such item could be located. She filed again, narrower, and received a similar answer that used slightly different phrasing as if an actual person had decided to make the refusal sound less like a form. Mallory did not give up. She visited the Hanley lot on a cloudy afternoon when the air smelled like rain and distant train brakes. The pad of the old foundation lay like a dull gray tooth against the weeds. A few stacked pallets leaned against a roll-up door on a new storage unit the owner was adding. She walked the perimeter slowly, counting her steps, listening. When she reached the place where a broken corner of concrete dipped into loam, her phone vibrated with a call from a number she didn't know. She answered without speaking first. A woman's voice said hello in that breathless, considerate tone people use when they are in a library or a church. Then the voice said, "Don't face it," and the connection filled with a rushing that did not sound like interference so much as wind in a narrow stairwell. Mallory said, "Who is this?" And the line went dead. Her call log recorded the number, but when she dialed it back, 3 hollow beeps told her it did not exist. She wrote the story anyway. She wrote it as a feature about the persistence of place, about the way a town layers its fears like paint over old wallpaper. She did not name the tape because she could not prove it. She did not accuse the department because she had no interest in being uninvited to the meetings where people say the things that matter when the recorder is off. She printed it in the Sunday edition with a photograph of her own hand closing around a fragment of blue and white ceramic she found near a place the old kitchen would have been, a piece of a plate, a vague pattern of flowers that had outlived the table where someone once set it down after drying the dish with a towel that smelled of sunshine. That would have been the end, a story people folded into their morning and forgot by lunch, if not for a thing that followed. 2 days after the story ran, a padded envelope arrived at the paper addressed to Mallory. Inside was a tape, no label, no return address, only a note on notebook paper torn from the center of a spiral. It read, "Not the same one, but you'll see." Her stomach let go a little. She set the tape on her desk, watched the sun strike its plastic edge, and told herself it was a prank as her skin tried to make her stand up and leave the building without her bag. She borrowed a VCR from the library, set it up in the paper's small conference room, and pressed play. The screen opened on a frame so ordinary that for half a minute her chest loosened with relief. It was a living room in a rental house, beige carpet, white walls, television against a wall, sofa with the kind of cushions that always look one day too old. Her reporter's brain started to inventory details she could track. A magnet from a diner in Cleveland on the fridge in a doorless kitchen, a floppy-eared dog bed with no dog in it, a blue rain jacket slung over a chair. Then she stopped taking notes because the camera angle was wrong in a way that made her palms sweat. The view came from a place slightly above the television, but too close to be an obvious shelf. It had that same chest-height perspective as the other tape, and there was no warble in the image a handheld camera would produce. The audio at first was nothing, and then faint, as if sound were arriving down a long hallway. A clock ticked. A floorboard gave a single, complaining groan as wood settled. Then, very softly, someone in another room said hello with that same considerate hush she had heard on the phone at the Hanley lot. The voice belonged to no one she knew. The word landed not as greeting, but as recognition, like when you answer your name in a roll call. Mallory waited for a person to enter the frame and explain the illusions we give ourselves when we watch an empty room long enough. No one did. Instead, the camera's focus shifted toward the black glass of the turned-off television, where something like a reflection began to show. It was not herself. It was the suggestion of a staircase behind her, wood darker than the floors in this room, rails braided with lamp shadow. The angle was wrong, impossible. It was as if the television were a window into a different place that did not care about the geometry of this address. A whisper came, clearer now. It said her last name, not entirely right, as if it struggled with the consonants. Then it said, "Don't face it." She did not touch the remote. She did not breathe for 2 beats. She did the thing the voice told her not to do. She stood up and stepped closer to the television until her own outline hovered on the glass. Her outline did not match the one in the tape. In the tape, the outline leaned toward the screen from an angle she could not occupy in this room. Her throat closed. She lunged for the stop button and punched it, then yanked the tape out like it might bite. Her fingers shook. She slid the cassette back into the padded envelope with the note and sealed it with a strip of tape like a bandage. She took the envelope to the sheriff's office with a tired half smile and a comment about pranks that get too personal. She did not want to keep that object in her building. Chief Whitaker, a man with kinder eyes than his jawline suggested, opened the envelope, looked at the tape, and said, in a voice that told her he had been waiting longer than she knew, "You should have brought this yesterday." He didn't mean to scold. He meant, this thing finds its way. He meant, we don't like bringing new names into its mouth. In a small room with a clock that ticked louder than a clock should, Whitaker, Doyle, Lena, and Mallory watched the tape together for precisely 1 minute and 8 seconds. The chief insisted on a timer. At 68 seconds, no matter what, he would stop it. He would unplug it from the wall if he had to. He said it like someone repeating a rule that is not written down but is followed because people who broke it could not bear to be the example. He pressed play. The room on the screen was the conference room they were sitting in, as if the tape had been made in the past hour. The chair where Mallory sat was empty in the image, as if in that version she had stepped away. The audio carried a sound none of them could mistake for anything else. The shuffle of someone climbing a narrow flight of stairs, the pause every 3 steps, the listening. Doyle put his knuckles on the table and did not move. Lena's lips parted, eyes fixed not on the screen, but on the window glass of the door to the hall, as if she expected to see a shadow pass by the small wired pane at any second. Whitaker's thumb hovered over the stop button from the first second. At 43 seconds, a whisper came. It said Mark, then Lena, then Mallory, then Chief, in a tone that somehow sounded courteous and delighted at once, as if the act of saying their names were a game. They all felt the floor vibrate. Doyle closed his eyes like a person bracing for a familiar pain. At 68 seconds, the Chief pressed stop with a flat palm that made the plastic button thwack. The tape rolled a fraction too long. The image shifted in that fraction, and they all saw, for less than a breath, the top landing of stairs none of them recognized, and the corner where a small hand lay on a nightstand, fingers flexing once. Whitaker unplugged the TV and the VCR from the wall and coiled the cords with a concentration that looked like prayer disguised as habit. He put the tape in a plastic case, like a lunch container, and lowered it into a locked drawer that did not look like it had ever held anything as ordinary as office supplies. He told them they would sign a piece of paper that said the envelope had arrived, that they had noted the contents, that the contents were not described beyond cassette. He did not say why the description was vague. He did not have to. Lena understood that to name a thing too precisely felt like an invitation. That night, Mallory sat up in bed at 2:17 a.m., alarm cold in her chest, because she had felt a shift on the mattress at her knees like a cat jumping up. She did not own a cat. She heard the soft, polite hello from the space near her closet, said in a tone that sounded less like a greeting and more like someone pronouncing a word out loud to learn what it felt like in their mouth. She did not turn her head. She moved her fingers very slowly to the lamp switch and turned on the light. The room looked exactly as she left it. The air, however, had that thickness of a stairwell where many feet have passed. She whispered into the lit room, "You can't make it let go," and surprised herself by crying without a noise. Days passed. The county moved on with the practiced amnesia of places that refused to let their worst things define them. A football game. A church bake sale. A rumor that the storage unit company had gone out of business because no one wanted to rent space on land where the ground remembered a table and a radio and a bed that faced a door at the wrong angle. Mallory wrote about other things, budgets and road repairs and a good kid who taught himself to tune pianos. She also visited a professor of media studies at the university one county over, a man who looked like a nice uncle and kept an oscilloscope on his desk for no reason he could explain that didn't sound like a hobby. His name was Leland Morrow. He listened to her carefully, hands steepled like someone pretending to pray, and then realizing they had continued to hold the pose because it helped them think. Morrow agreed to examine the audio from the tape without watching the video. He said the old VCR had an audio out he could patch into his own equipment. He said it would preserve his objectivity, then laughed because objectivity was a word academics use when they mean, "I need a ritual that makes me brave." They borrowed the department's machine and set it up in a lab that smelled like dust and old coffee. The waveform rose on his monitor like a soft mountain range. He found signal where there should have been nothing and silence where signal should live. He found a narrowband tone riding the entire recording, sometimes drifting just above human hearing. He said, tearing his eyes from the screen with evident effort, "This feels like something learning to hum along." He asked if he could see 68 seconds of the footage with the sound muted. Mallory said no and felt something like relief flash through the room, as if the walls themselves waited for that answer. Morrow respected the refusal and wrote his notes with ink that seemed to dry too slowly, letters smearing at the edges like they wanted to move. He emailed her later that night with a simple message that consisted of 2 lines. The first line said, "You don't want to be right about this." The second line said, "But I don't think you're wrong." As with all things people don't entirely understand, a second tape eventually appeared, not because anyone sought it, but because this is how such stories sustain their own breath. It arrived not in the mail, but on a shelf in the back of the archive's cage, placed perfectly square on top of a ledger from a year when Lena had not yet been born. She only saw it because she felt a draft move along her ankles, as if someone who had just passed by had brushed the air. She stood absolutely still, afraid that if she moved too quickly, she would step into the place where the draft had been and discover that the absence had more shape than the presence. The second tape looked like the first, unmarked, no label at all. She used a marker to write "no" on both edges, then put it in a separate case and took it to Whitaker with a composure she did not feel. He did not want to watch it. He also could not imagine not watching it. He chose 68 seconds again. This time, before he pressed play, he said a thing he had never said out loud at work. He said, "If it says your name, you don't say mine in return." He didn't know why that felt like the rule, it just did. The second tape showed the Hanley house as it had been in those earlier sequences, but from a different angle. The camera sat on the landing upstairs, aimed at a door left slightly ajar. The hand on the nightstand returned, fingers flexing once, slow. The tone Morrow had described became a feeling along the gum line in the watchers' mouths, a faint ache like the anticipation of a storm. 30 seconds in, the audio, though muted, seemed to push at the edges of the room like pressure. 40 seconds. 50. Doyle counted in his head and found his counting didn't align with the seconds, as if the tape had its own minute hand. At 62 seconds, the door in the picture swung wider without a hand on the knob. The bed sat empty. The water glass was half full. The journal had shifted a fraction, the elastic band now slanting. A voice that none of them could hear because the sound was muted, nevertheless placed itself in the geometry of the room like a new piece of furniture, and Mallory squeezed her eyes shut because she felt her own name forming behind her teeth unbidden. At 68 seconds, the chief pressed stop with a controlled, almost sorrowing finality. The screen went blue, the VCR whirred, the sound horribly domestic. They decided then, not with a ceremony, but with the muscle memory of people who have survived storms, that the tapes would be locked in a metal cabinet against the far wall, and that an inventory would list them only as 2 cassettes associated with a closed property matter. No one spoke of destroying them, no one raised fire or hammers. There was a sense that smashing the plastic would be like breaking the surface of a pond with your hand and discovering that what lies beneath does not like its mirror breached. Life layered itself back on top of the fear. Halloween came and went. The first hard frost silvered the grass behind the courthouse. The storage unit company finally rented 3 units to a contractor who didn't live in the county and didn't know to ask questions he wouldn't like the answers to. People hugged each other in supermarkets. They argued at the gas station about a new traffic pattern by the high school. The world did what it does, pretending the strange thing is contained when it has only been put in a place where the lights are rarely on. Mallory kept a single page from Morrow's notebook on her refrigerator with a magnet from a diner not in Cleveland, but in Altoona, a magnet shaped like a piece of pie. On that page, Morrow had drawn a staircase with 6 steps and written pauses here, 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 as if the pattern meant something. She found it soothing in a way. She found it good to remind herself that people can name beats even if they cannot stop the measure from playing. When the phone rang once at night and stopped, and her caller ID showed her own number, she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and said to the empty kitchen, "I won't face you." The clock on the microwave ticked 1 minute forward, and nothing else moved. You can hear the story and tell yourself the tape is the villain. You can tell yourself the people who watched it were reckless, arrogant, naive. You can tell yourself you would have locked it away at once and never let it near an outlet again. Maybe you would have. Maybe you wouldn't have. The truth that settled over Mill County like a thin frost was simpler and worse. The tape was not just a thing that captured images and sound, it was a room that learned rooms. It was a staircase that practiced the weight of new feet. It did not swallow people whole. It waited until they answered when it spoke softly from the dark. It took names, the way ivy takes brick, slowly, patiently, without intending harm, the way a plant does not intend, but nevertheless cracking the mortar. There are still drawers at the sheriff's office labeled with neat, patient handwriting. There are still shelves where the lights go on and off on timers. There is still a metal cabinet against the far wall with a log clipped to its front. The cabinet is locked. The key is signed out rarely, always with another person present, always with the accompanying decision to stop at 68 seconds. In the deadest part of night, when the streetlights wash the sidewalk in the color of dishwater and the vending machines click as their compressors switch on, a draft moves along the floor by the evidence cage, and a dispatcher at a desk far down the hall hears a soft, embarrassed tapping on the archives door. If you ever find a cassette at the bottom of a box from a place where the ground remembers footsteps, if you ever read the words "do not watch" written by a hand that pressed too hard with the marker, if you ever feel a stair tread flex under your foot in a house with no stairs, keep your eyes on your own hands. Keep your mouth closed around your own name. Keep the television dark. The tape was locked away for decades, not because the images were obscene, not because the sounds were inadmissible, but because what it learns, it does not forget, and what it says back to you will sound so much like care that you might mistake it for kindness. Don't. When you hear the soft hello in a room that should be empty, answer with silence and walk away while your legs still know your weight. The basement that should have stayed locked. The house at the corner of Maple Street had a way of shrinking the world around it. The sycamores leaned close over the roof. The sidewalk dipped as if the ground itself did not want to pass in front of the porch. Even in summer, when the rest of town hummed with lawnmowers and late baseball games and the soft pulse of cicadas, that address seemed to breathe in a different rhythm. People crossed the street without thinking. Eyes forward, steps quick. They said it was a shame about the Kellers. They said it was better not to dwell on things that would not come back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Thomas moved to town at the start of a thick, humid stretch, the kind of air that left fingerprints on glass. He rented a basement apartment behind the old laundromat on Birch Avenue and took a night job stocking at the big box store by the highway. It suited him to work while the town slept. Less traffic, fewer faces to read. He told himself he liked the quiet of empty aisles and the steady logic of boxes that needed to be where they belonged. On a Tuesday after midnight, he cut down Maple on the walk home, backpack slung on one shoulder, shoes whispering against the cracked pavement. There was nothing unusual about the night at first. A single porch light, 3 houses away. A distant train horn sliding through the humid dark. He would remember with certainty the exact moment his feet stopped. It was 12:4 1 a. He checked his phone because the time felt like a pin fastening a page to the wall. In the dirt strip beneath the Keller house windows, a thin rectangle of glass at ground level exhaled a second of light from below. Not a passing car, not a reflection. It pulsed once, pale and cold, and died. He kept walking for 6 steps, told himself it was an appliance dying, a battery coughing its last breath. He turned at the end of the block and came back. The light flashed again from the cellar window, a longer glow, a little brighter, as if something below ground struck a match and held it close to stone. He listened then. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. 3 heartbeats, then a knock from beneath the earth. 1 knock, a pause, a second. The sound traveled through the dirt and into his legs. He told himself a raccoon had gotten into the crawl space. He told himself the stories were small-town shadows stretching for attention. He stepped off the sidewalk into the brittle grass. The front steps creaked under him. The rusting handle turned with a tired sigh. Inside, the smell hit him. Wet paper, cold iron, a memory of bleach that had never reached the places that mattered. The hallway pressed in. Wallpaper peeled like old bandages. A fan of dust trembled in his phone light. He moved past a living room that still held a couch in a shape that remembered backs and elbows. He moved past a dining room where the table wore a skin of gray and the chandelier hung one bulb short like a missing tooth. He found the basement door at the end, a door different from the others. Heavy planks, newer than the rest of the wood. A thick chain threaded through iron eye plates. A busted padlock with teeth marks of rust. He put his ear to the seam. The cold rolled out through the slit and slid over his face. The knock came again, close to where his ear pressed. He flinched. The chain rattled. He pulled the door an inch, and the basement pulled back with a breath he could feel but not hear. The stairs were narrow and damp. Stone walls waited below, black where water wept. He took each step with the flat of his foot, testing for rot. The beam of his phone shivered. It brushed old jam jars on a shelf seeded with white dust. It found a workbench, a coil of rope, a saw with a smile of missing teeth. It found the walls, symbols carved into stone, not careful or pretty, hard and fast, deep where the chisel slipped, circles with tails, lines joined in knots. Rough figures standing in groups of 3. Some of the marks were dark with something that had dried and once had weight to it. He said his own name inside his head as a way of not saying the word leave. He swept the light in a slow arc, and there on a table, warped by damp, lay a leather-bound book the color of old coffee. He touched it. The cover stuck and then let go. The first pages were full of the same figures he saw on the walls. Then writing began, English that tilted up to the right. He read a line and did not understand. He read the next and did. Keep it locked. Do not open. Keep it locked and it will not leave the hole. Keep it locked and it will not know your name. The scratching started above him, a long rag of sound drawn slow over wood. He pointed the light up the stairs. The door at the top trembled as if a draft breathed through the house. The scratching crossed the door. It became a pushing. The chain groaned. He grabbed the book and backed toward the far wall, where 2 cinder blocks looked new against the age of the stone. He saw then a patch the size of a window that had been bricked over with unusual care. Mortar smoother than the rest. No gaps, no cracks. He felt a small wind where no wind should be, and the phone light flicked once. He held the book like a shield and moved. He reached the stairs by feeling with his shins. The chain lifted and rattled as if hands unseen were testing it from the other side. He shoved the door with his shoulder and swung the chain back into place. He pressed his palm flat to the wood. It pressed back with a softness like the throat of a sleeping animal. He did not run out of the house. He walked because running would have turned the hallway long as a tunnel and the porch a mile away. Outside, on the sidewalk, he swallowed the warm night like medicine. He held the book under his arm and did not look back until he reached the corner. When he did look, the basement window was dark again. He told himself out loud that he would return the book the next day. He told himself he did not believe anything the book needed him to believe. He lived with the book on his small kitchen table because placing it anywhere else made the apartment lean. He made coffee and put the book beside the mug. He slept in the early morning and dreamed of wooden stairs under a lake at 3:17 p.m. As he folded a shirt, he heard a thud in the floor, soft like a hand laid flat against a door from the other side. He froze. He told himself a truck outside had bounced over a pothole and the sound had traveled through the concrete. He waited. 10 seconds. Then another soft thud from under the kitchen linoleum. He stepped backward and regretted that his apartment was below ground level. He stepped backward again, and his heel touched the carpet runner that led to his own basement door. He stood at the top of his stairs for a long time with his palm on the knob and the book under his arm. The thud did not come again. He told himself he had imagined it. He told himself that the sound under his feet belonged to pipes and old buildings and air. That night at work, he stacked boxes of toothpaste and bleach and dog food, and the aisles felt longer. At 2:08 a.m., his supervisor asked if he was all right. He said he was fine and realized the words had the weight of someone trying to remember whether they had turned off the stove. By Friday, he had read enough of the journal to understand the shape of the story without the dates he chose not to see. The Kellers had bought the house and learned immediately not to spend time in the basement. The writing made small circles around details and then slid off. They heard things. They saw light where there should not be light. They slept with the windows locked, even in heat. The handwriting changed halfway through the book. The second hand pressed harder, the loops taller, as if the letters needed to take up more room to be louder than the sound from beneath. Keep it locked. Do not put your ear to the door. Do not say your name at the top of the stairs. If you step down with a partner. Do not argue on the stairs. The last page before the leather cracked into the binding had a list. Fix the hinge on the chain plate. Replace the lock when the moon is full. Fill the gap under the door with salt and sugar. When it whispers the names of your dead, do not answer. When it says it is cold, do not answer. When it says it will be quiet if you let it breathe, do not answer. On Saturday morning at 10:27, the metal chair at his kitchen table trembled as if a truck passed outside. The walls did not shake, the glass in the cabinet did not clink, only the chair. He lifted the seat and found 3 grains of coarse salt lined up as if someone had placed them there on purpose. He thought of a prank he could not explain. He swept the grains into his palm and threw them into the sink. That night at 3:03, the radio in his bedroom turned on by itself and hissed a long breath of static. The sound rose and fell. Not a station, not a pattern that made sense. It felt like listening to someone breathe through their teeth on the other side of a heavy curtain. He went to the library because daylight often reduces the size of things in the mind. The local history corner, tucked by the genealogy shelves, held a rolled map of the town from before the highway. A librarian with a name badge that said Mara showed him the index cards for property deeds. He found Keller in pencil and someone else before them, and a gap after. He found a smaller box of clippings that smelled of old basement and lemon cleaner. One article mentioned a boy lost near the river. Another followed a string of break-ins where nothing was taken except photographs from frames. A short column explained that the church on Cedar had once tried to organize a community prayer at the Keller house, but canceled when 2 of the volunteers fell ill on the front steps. The paper avoided words like curse. It used words like unfortunate and ongoing. The librarian lowered her voice to ask if he had known the family. He said no. He asked if anyone had been allowed into the basement when the house was boarded. The librarian paused and said she did not know, and then said she had never seen anyone go in or out for years. On the way home, he stopped at Riggs Hardware and bought a new padlock and a loop of chain and a bag of rock salt because the journal had given him a list, and lists could be useful even when they came from the wrong rooms. He sat at a small table and felt the cool paper of the receipt in his hand and thought about how unreasonable it was to be comforted by an itemized list. He made a plan in slow breathing. He would go back at dusk when the street held more sound. He would put the lock on the chain properly. He would not go down the stairs. He would leave the book under the heavy slab of a toolbox borrowed from the stockroom because the idea of returning the book felt like pulling a nail from a beam that had never squeaked until someone touched it. At 6:12, he stood on the Keller porch with the bag of salt in his left hand and the chain in his right. The door opened like a mouth too willing. The hallway felt the same, the air did not. He could smell metal as clearly as if a handful of pennies had warmed in his palm. He reached the basement door and found the chain as he had left it, but the lock lay on the floor with its body intact and its shackles straight as a finger. The shear had not been made by a tool. He told himself he did not have time to invent what it had been made by. He wound the new chain through both plates and snapped the lock closed. He poured a line of salt along the seam at the bottom of the door. He sprinkled a handful across each stair, and the tiny crystals clicked like sleet. He kept his breathing slow and shallow because he could hear his own breath, and he did not want to hear anything else inside his breath. He left the house and walked to the end of the block and turned around in the middle of the street. He wanted to see whether anything about the house had changed now that he had done something inside it. The sky was a bruised blue, the windows were dull eyes, a single mosquito drifted around his knee, and then the basement window flashed again with a colder light than fluorescent bulbs or phones. He took a step back. The light winked out. He whispered the address in his head and felt the number fall through him like a key. Sunday bled into Monday with thin sleep and thick coffee. He went to work and stocked shampoo and paper towels and metal shelving pins. He tried to think about nothing except the shape of each thing in his hands. On break, he watched the bakery workers frost cupcakes behind glass and imagined a town where basements contained only spiders and paint cans. At one point, 5:09 a.m., his phone vibrated against his thigh where he had set it on a stack of cardboard. The screen lit the inside of the receiving bay like a small moon. No name, no number, just the words withheld and a line of silence when he put it to his ear. He said hello and heard his own breath return twice slower and twice colder than he had sent it out. On Tuesday afternoon, he heard a knock in his own basement. Not a thud, not a settling of the building, a single knock. Then another, the same 2 count as the house on Maple. He walked down his own stairs with the book tucked next to his ribs. The air smelled of dust and laundry soap and something a little sour that might have been old water. He stood with his hand on the light chain, but did not pull it. He told the basement he could hear it. He told the basement he would not open the door at Maple again. He said his own name softly in the middle of a sentence because words can carry names when you slip them safely. At 3:07 a.m., he woke to the radio. Hiss again. And this time, the static had a pattern, like words muffled under a blanket. He listened and told himself what he heard was only the shape of language and not language. Then a word formed that he knew to be his name, even though it did not sound like his name spoken by any person he had ever met. It sounded like someone had written his name on a piece of paper and set that paper on a table and dragged a fingernail under the letters over and over until the paper had worn thin. He took the book to work because he did not want it in the apartment while he slept, and he did not want it in the locker in the break room where other hands might open it. During the quiet part of the shift, he sat on a forklift with the book on his lap and read. The later pages were not entries. They were sentences, like nails. Do not make bargains in the stairwell. Do not agree to anything from the landing. It will tell you that it is not your problem. It will tell you that the ones who kept it locked were cruel. It will tell you that the light in the window means it is weak. It will tell you that if you open the door, it will leave through the front and never return. When you hear it say a name you knew once, understand that it is not that voice and that the person it belongs to is not on the stairs waiting for you to help. He decided to ask someone in uniform for advice, not help. Advice seemed smaller. He walked into the police station on Wednesday, just after noon, and asked at the front desk whether there had been calls about Maple Street. The desk sergeant put his elbows on the counter and said people called about that block every few months, kids and dares and noises. He wrote down the address and nodded to a map on the wall and said a patrol car would swing by. The sergeant asked whether Thomas was a relative of the previous owners. Thomas said no. He said he was concerned about a vacant property and the possibility of people getting inside. He did not mention the journal. He did not mention the marks on the wall. He did not mention how sleep had begun to feel like a room with an unlocked door facing downhill. Later that day, he met Nolan from the stockroom for coffee at the diner with the neon clock in the window. The server called them honey and set down 2 mugs and a plate with pie that tasted like nutmeg and sugar. Thomas told him enough of the story that Nolan's eyes got wide and then smaller, and then Nolan laughed and said a man has to find a better hobby than breaking into houses. Thomas smiled because the conversation felt like folding a blanket neatly after a storm. Nolan said he would walk past the place with him after work for a thrill. Thomas said no very quickly and then softer. Nolan shrugged and said he did not scare easily. Thomas said it was not fear that mattered, it was attention. Some places grew when you looked at them. That night, after the shift ended, they did not walk down Maple. They took Birch and went directly to their apartments. Thomas watched through the blinds until he saw Nolan's living room light come on 2 buildings down. He let his breathing go long and slow. At 2:26 a.m., a thud shook the thin wall between Thomas and the laundry room. Then a sound like someone dragging cardboard across concrete. He stood, and the floor felt like the deck of a boat. He pressed his palm to the wall, and the wall hummed like a tuning fork. He thought of the bricked patch in the Keller cellar and the way the mortar had looked newer, even though nothing in that house should qualify as new. At 2:31 a.m., he heard footsteps on birch. 2 sets, one heavier and one soft and quick. He looked through the blinds again. Nolan walked fast toward Maple with his phone held like a lantern. Beside him, a shorter shape kept pace. Thomas pulled on shoes and grabbed nothing else because everything else felt like it would slow him down. By the time he reached the corner, Nolan was already on the front steps with the door open, and the shorter figure had slipped inside. Thomas swallowed the taste of metal and followed. The hallway did not so much welcome them as forget to stop them. At the basement door, the chain lay in a loose curve on the floor, and one end of it was black as if it had spent time in smoke. The door leaned off its swollen frame, and in the gap, Thomas could see the top 3 stairs like vertebrae in a spine. Nolan said he had heard his sister's voice on the phone. He said the voice had stopped speaking when he stood near his kitchen sink, and then he had heard it at his back, as if the phone had turned into a mouth. He said she had sounded like she had when they were little and scared on storm nights. He said she had asked him whether he remembered the basement of their childhood home and the way he would count the steps out loud to calm her. He said he had come to count these steps and make a joke of it. He said he would call her as soon as he showed the scary old house that he could walk downstairs without shaking. The shorter figure that had slipped inside had gone down ahead of him. Thomas did not see it then, in a way his mind would let him examine. He would decide later that there are shapes meant only to be noticed by the back of the eyes. He reached out and placed his palm on Nolan's forearm. The skin was cold, as if he had been outside in winter. Nolan looked at him, and the look was the look of a man who has already decided to do a thing and is only waiting to be allowed to begin. Thomas saw the strange softness in the corners of his mouth. He said they would stand on the landing only. He said they would count to 10 and then go up again. He said they would not say any names. He said they would not answer anything they heard. They stepped down. The air on the stairs did not feel like cold air. It felt like the absence of a smell and the absence of warmth and the absence of a sound hitting a wall and returning. The light from their phones found the same jam jars and the same workbench and the same carved symbols. It found the bricked patch. It found scuff marks in the dust where something had traced a circle around the table and then stopped and then traced a circle in the opposite direction. The radio hiss came from nowhere and everywhere. Under it, other noises rose like small things in a drawer trying to slide to the front. They stood on the landing. They counted. 1 to 10 took longer than it should and shorter than they wanted. As they reached 9, a voice rose from the bottom stair, thin with distance but near his breath. It said a word like help, elongated to twice the length that word normally wears. Nolan's face changed like a surface when a reflection moves across it. Thomas gripped Nolan's forearm where the pulse tapped hard. He said the list in the book again. Do not answer. Do not bargain. Do not take a single step down after you promised yourself you would not. At 9.5, the voice said a different sound. Not help. A nickname Thomas understood to belong to a boy in a kitchen long ago. Nolan almost laughed because happiness and grief sometimes look the same when they arrive at exactly the wrong time. He leaned forward 1 inch and the stair under his foot clicked the way wood does when it admits weight. Something turned its head at the bottom. The air tilted. Thomas dragged him back with both arms and hit the door with his shoulder and swung it closed and shoved the chain through with fumbling hands. The thing on the other side stepped up 3 stairs with the sound of 1 step. The door pushed against his back like a slow wave. The chain pulled against the plates. The lock took his shaking and held. He and Nolan stood with their foreheads almost touching because there was nowhere else to look. Nolan's eyes watered as if he stood in bright sunlight. The pushing against the door stopped, but the sound did not. The sound became a long, soft rubbing against wood. Then nothing. Then a knock. The same one, and then two. The heavy breath passed into the hall and receded. He did not listen at the seam. He walked backward with the book tucked to his chest and the lock pinched in his fingers like a coin. Outside, the night was not a relief. The sky hung still as the inside of a cupboard. They walked without speaking to Birch. When they reached Nolan's building, he said he would call his sister. He said he would not tell her where he had been. His mouth trembled like the waterline of a lake when a boat has long gone by. Thomas nodded and did not say, "Be careful, because words turn into loose nails when you need beams." He went home and sat on his kitchen floor and leaned his head against the cabinet. He fell asleep there for a few minutes or an hour. He woke to his phone, flashing a sliver of light on the ceiling and buzzing without a name. He did not answer. The book lay on the linoleum, open to the page with the list. He traced one line with a finger until the letters warmed under his skin. He stood and filled a bowl with salt and went to his own basement door and poured a thin white seam. He whispered that he would keep the door closed because there are doors you close for your own safety, and there are doors you close for the safety of others, and sometimes they are the same door. On Thursday, in the wet heat of afternoon, he found Mara, the librarian, at her desk. He asked a different question. He asked whether she knew anything about a bricked area in the Keller cellar. She swallowed and said she did not, and then she did the thing a helpful person does when small talk is no longer a good coat. She said her uncle had done drywall for the town years ago and had gone to the Keller place once. He had refused to step below the top stair. He had come home and said he had felt a small wind blowing on his fingers from under the door like the breath of something close to the floor. He had said a family before the Kellers had built a wall to hide a well that had once been in the cellar, a well that did not lead to groundwater, a well that led to something else. The town had filled wells before. Old ones that calves fell into or that swallowed loose ash. They had never filled that one with dirt. They had put stones and boards across it and then built a wall to force themselves to forget. Thomas thanked her and walked out into sun that felt like heavy milk. He bought a sledgehammer and a chisel at the hardware store because doing nothing had begun to feel like opening a door by standing very still near it. He told himself he would go at first light when the birds made a lot of honest noise. He told himself he would knock 3 bricks out and then decide what next to do. He told himself that breaking open the seal would be the first step to resealing it properly. He did not tell himself that people who open things often believe closing them will be much easier than it is. At 5:1 a.m. on Friday, he stood on the stairs to the Keller cellar with the sledge in both hands. He took 2 steps down and stopped because the air below smelled like wet pennies and old paper. He took 1 more step and planted his feet as if he stood in a canoe. He swung the sledge in a small, controlled arc because there was nowhere to widen. The head met the brick with a noise that felt like biting down hard on a fork. A shard dropped and skittered across the floor. He swung again. Mortar dust rose and lived in his nose and throat. A third swing loosened a brick the size of his hand. He pried it out and set it down, and his skin did not want to release it. The hole was a mouth as high as his shin and as wide as his palm. He put his ear near, but not to it. He heard nothing at first. He heard a sound, then like distant wind through trees. He realized there were no trees underground. He realized the sound was very quiet and very close, and not wind. He widened the hole by 1 more brick because stopping at 1 felt like a kind of insult that would be answered in a language he did not speak. Through the opening, the dark was not flat. It bent inward like the first step into an elevator shaft. A small rush of cold kissed his knuckles. The smell of iron deepened. He lifted his phone and put the light to the gap. The beam went 5 feet down and then met a shape that reflected light like wet glass. Water lay in a still black circle, waiting for the phone light to land on it so it could pretend to be the sky. A ring of old wood ended where the water began. Iron spikes rimmed the wood like teeth that had lost some but not all of their neighbors. They were wired together with thin strands of dark metal. Small bells dangled on two of the wires. He had seen such bells tied to doorknobs at Christmas in houses that wanted to be visited. Here, they were a warning for the inside, a stop for the upward motion of anything that wanted to climb. He heard then a note from one of the bells, so soft he might have dreamed it while awake. Not a jingle, a tart, faint sound like the first sound a glass makes when a finger finds it. He felt the stair under him tilt a hair. He stepped back and hit the wall with his shoulder, and the sledge swung low and knocked the edge of the table, and the leather book slid an inch and settled. He wanted to put the bricks back with gentle hands. He wanted to push them into place like the way you tuck a child into bed. He realized with a clarity that hurt that the wall had not been built to keep people away from the well. It had been built to make time pass more smoothly above it. He whispered, "Keep it locked," and the words did not feel like superstition. They felt like a simple instruction for a tool with teeth. He placed the first brick and the second, and his breath shortened as if he had been running. The mortar he had brought in a plastic tub went on with a butter knife, and the work looked clumsy and young next to the smooth line he had broken. He set the third brick and tapped it and heard the bell below speak again. It sounded like laughter that had not learned the joke. The room changed then, the way a room changes when another person steps into it behind you. He felt a small pressure at his lower back that might have been cold air climbing. He stood, and the phone light swung and found a wet track on the floor, leading from the bricked patch to the foot of the stairs, and then stopping as if a careful stopper had put a palm down and said no farther for now. He lifted the salt bag and poured a thick ribbon across the track. The grains hung in the air for a half second as if tasting, and then fell. He stepped to the door and pulled it shut and fed the chain through and clicked the lock. He pressed his head to the wood. The other side felt like a tongue pressed to the back of teeth. He kept Friday small. He sat in his apartment with the radio unplugged and the book on top of the refrigerator because the higher the object, the less likely it felt to reach up. At 3 a.m. The floor knocked under his feet twice. He said he heard it. He said he was not answering. He said his name inside a word that did not belong to him. Saturday felt like walking through someone else's house while they slept in the next room. At one point, 04 p.m., the laundromat dryer, 2 doors down, stopped mid-cycle and no quarters fell through the slot. He heard a sound like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. He ate a sandwich without tasting it. He fell asleep at 7 and woke at 11 because the building sighed, and then he realized that he had not heard the building sigh so humanly before. He walked to Maple and stood across the street in the empty midnight like a piece of furniture on the curb. The house wore its shadow evenly. A stray cat moved across the yard and did not glance at the window well. He went home and sat at the table and turned the book to the last page again. In pencil so faint he could have missed it, a final line waited. If it leaves the hole, it will not want to go far at first. It will want a basement with stairs. It can count. It will want a place. It can learn the shape of your footsteps. It will want to know the names you say when you are too tired to think. Give it none. Give it nothing. Give it back the dark. On Sunday evening, a storm rose the way summer storms do, angry in the distance, and then in the living room all at once. Rain hit the sidewalk like rice. Lightning pressed white against the blinds. The basement under his apartment breathed cool and close, as if the storm had opened something in it. He considered calling someone and could not think who. He tried to imagine how he would explain a well that did not want water. He told himself he would give it back the dark, and he picked up the hammer he kept near his own door and the bag of salt and the book, because the book had been with him for each hour that mattered, and that kind of company counts for something. At 12:05, 8 a.m., he stood again in the Keller hall. The chandelier strained with a seam of light from the storm. The basement door looked bigger and at the same time tight with its own edges. He placed the book on the first stair because some objects understand where they should be set. He ran his palm along the chain. He touched the lock. The wood felt dry under his hand even as rain sang outside. He opened the door only enough to breathe. He spoke to the dark the way you speak to a dog that is backed under a bed. He said he would bring bricks and new mortar tomorrow at noon. He said he would finish the job before the next sun slid down. He said he would not listen to anything but the sound of the trowel and the bell and his own counting. He said he would not be fooled by names in familiar shapes. The next morning, at 11:02, he stood in the aisle at Riggs and bought 2 bags of mix and a new trowel and a pair of gloves. The kid at the counter asked if he had a project. He said yes and then laughed because the word project landed like a paper airplane in a place where there was no air. He carried the buckets to Maple in 2 trips and felt each trip cut through the heat. He set the first bucket on the porch and then turned back for the second. When he looked again after crossing the street, the bucket had shifted an inch to the left toward the door. He did not go to it quickly. He walked slow and placed the second bucket next to the first, and both were still. He told himself that the porch was uneven and the wood had remembered how to be a ramp in rain. Before he could begin, he saw Deputy Hawkins step out of a cruiser and lift a hand. The deputy had a face that looked older when he was listening. He said there had been a noise complaint last night from 2 streets over. He asked whether Thomas was a contractor. Thomas said no. He said he was a neighbor. The deputy said the town was thinking of condemning the house for real this time and clearing the lot because of kids and fires and liabilities. He said they would get a crew in the next month. He asked whether Thomas had been inside. Thomas looked at the buckets. He looked at the deputy. He said the house had a problem, and it was old, and it did not save receipts. The deputy studied him the way a man studies a map he does not trust. He said to be careful and to call if he saw anyone else trying to go down there. He said the last thing he needed was a group of teenagers going missing because they like a dare. He drove off slowly, watching his mirrors. Thomas worked. He worked in the way that gets inside the skull and quiets it. He pulled 3 bricks and scraped the hole smooth and widened it to square. He looked down and saw the bells waiting like sleeping birds. He poured the first thin wall of mix and set in a brick and pressed. He heard a tiny note from the bell and set the next brick and pressed. He counted the seconds on his phone and pressed again. He waited for the line to take. He spread more and pressed, and when the sound came again, he said he did not hear it. The air thinned. The skin of his neck crawled as if a small hand tested his hair. He did not reach up. He set another brick. The first bucket emptied, and he fetched the second. He moved through the kitchen and imagined the Kellers cooking breakfast in a house that held itself tighter each day around them. He imagined a woman pressing a note into a book because the walls needed more words to stay closed. He returned to the hole, and the smell of iron had softened, and the bells had gone quiet. He set 4 more bricks. He pressed with the flat of his gloved hand and felt the resistance of something that did not like to be touched, but did not know how to avoid it when it came from the right angle with the right pressure and the right not listening. By 2:49 p.m., the hole had become, again, a seam. His work did not match the old work, but it held the way 2 hands can hold, even when one is small. He poured thin salt water into the mortar and watched the line drink. He took the book and set it on the table and put both palms on the cover and said what he had learned to say. Keep it locked, do not answer. Give it back the dark. He walked up into the bright, hard day, and the world felt flat and real and ordinary in a way that made him almost giddy. He laughed once, and the laugh sounded like air finding a pocket that had been sealed. He locked the house door behind him and felt for the first time that the lock belonged to a house and not to a throat. The nights after that were not empty. Nothing goes back to what it was before. But the knocks in his own basement softened to the sound of a building remembering itself. The radio hissed once, and then never again. He slept 3 hours in a row, then 4. He left the book on a high shelf and did not touch it unless he had to move the ladder. He checked Maple each morning on his way home when the sun pressed yellow on the pavement. The basement window held nothing but his own reflection looking down. 2 weeks later, the town posted a bright notice on a stake in the front yard that said work order and a lot number and a date. A week after that, a crew in hard hats and shirts with logos put up a new fence with a padlock and took photographs and measured with a wheel. They nodded and ate sandwiches on the curb, and Thomas watched them leave with the slow relief of someone realizing that the storm had moved far enough away that thunder could be remembered as a story and not a present tense. The night before the demolition was scheduled, he woke at 3:11 a.m. with a clear thought sitting in his mind like a person in a chair. He dressed, he put on boots, he put the book in his backpack. He walked down Maple in the hush that happens before the first bird remembers to be a bird. He climbed the fence because the lock on a fence is a lock on a line, and sometimes a line wants to be stepped over. He stood on the porch and listened. Inside the house, the air smelled like wood and old sugar. The basement door waited with its chain and lock and seam of salt that had turned into a white ribbon glued to the floor by summer damp. He put his palm flat to the wood, and he could feel nothing there for the first time. No breath, no push, no distant bell. He unlocked the chain. He opened the door just enough to whisper the number of days since he had reset the wall. He said he had done what he could with the hands he had. He said the work would be loud tomorrow and then quiet. He said if silence could be a promise, he was making it as best he could. As he turned to go up, he heard a sound that did not make his stomach jump. A small clink like china being set gently on a shelf. He smiled and closed the door and set the chain without hurry. On the porch, he stood very still and looked at the first slice of gray behind the trees. He realized he was crying, small, silent tears like condensation. He wiped them away and did not bother to explain to himself why. The machines came mid-morning. A backhoe took the porch first, and the men shouted the easy words of work that goes as planned. When the bucket took the first bite of the front wall, a dark dust rose, and the driver lifted a hand for a brake while it cleared. Thomas stood across the street with coffee cooling in his hand. He told himself that someday this would be a flat lot with grass and perhaps a new house that would never teach its owners new meanings for the word below. The basement walls came last. The crew hesitated with the hole in the ground. They discussed a plan with gestures that did not reach the street. In the end, they filled the cavity with crushed stone and concrete. The driver said, if a man cannot see his reflection in a thing, it is less likely to think it is a mirror. The foreman laughed and shook his head. They smoothed the surface and left orange cones the way sailors leave lights. That evening, Thomas walked to the fresh slab and stood on it. The concrete held his weight without talking. He imagined the well under layers of stone and powder and weight. He imagined the bells caught forever in a mix of sand and water and Portland cement. He imagined that sound traveling up through solid rock and not finding any ears, because some sounds do not need to be heard to know that they have stopped. He went home and put the book in a box with a tight lid and carried it to a storage unit out by the highway where units sit like teeth in a long, quiet mouth. He signed the paper and set the box on a top shelf and felt the strange lightness that comes when you put something heavy where it belongs. Weeks passed. The town forgot in the way towns do. Someone painted the laundromat door a new blue. The neon clock at the diner stopped flickering. Maple Street at night smelled like cut grass and a little like gasoline when the crews moved their trucks. Thomas went to work at night and came home near morning. He counted the steps to his own basement sometimes as he passed the door, because counting can be a kind of prayer and a kind of promise. On a Sunday evening in late heat and long shadows, he took a walk toward the river. On the way back, he felt the pull of the old address, and he turned down Maple so that he could confirm a thing he already knew. The lot where the house had stood was a smooth gray shape with a skin of dust and two small weeds already testing the edge. He stood at the curb and thought about how people say ground takes what you give it. He thought about how some gifts are heavy and some are not, and how sometimes the only difference is a chain and a lock, and a person who will set the chain again when it loosens. The night rose like a slow tide. The cicadas wound up. A car hissed past. He turned to go, and in the corner of his eye, he saw a pulse of pale light. He went very still. He let his head turn slowly until he looked square at the place where the old basement window had been. There was nothing there now but concrete the color of chalk. The light did not come from the ground. It came from the storm drain at the edge of the curb. A small square of water reflected something not present in the sky. It pulsed once, twice. It went still. He stood without moving. He did not lean closer. He did not speak to the water. He reached in his pocket and found 3 grains of salt that had worked their way into the seam of the fabric and lodged there for weeks. He dropped them at his feet and watched them vanish into the dust. At home, he sat at the table without turning on the light and listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the slow click of the cooling pipes. He waited for the radio that was not plugged in to make a noise, and it did not. He slept and dreamed of a field covered in frost that did not melt when the sun rose. He woke at 6:12 a.m., exactly without an alarm, and knew that sometimes a thing stays locked because a person decides each day to keep it that way. He did not go back to the storage unit for a long time. When he finally did, the box on the top shelf was as he had left it. He brought it down and set it on the concrete floor and touched the lid and then left it closed. He lifted the box and put it back in its place, because some stories work better as weight than as words. He walked out into heat that smelled like tar and rain. He breathed and felt the breath go all the way in and all the way out without catching on a nail or a bell or a stair. He went home on Birch and stepped over his own basement door the way a person steps over a sleeping dog. He remembered the list and understood that it was not a list of rules. It was a list of choices a person could lay out each day like tools. He turned on the coffee. He waited for it to finish. He stood and listened to nothing that he did not invite. He said a sentence without names and without bargains. He said the simple truth of the street and the house and the whole. Some doors must stay closed. Some doors are not doors. The basement on Maple taught him both. He keeps that lesson like a lock in the pocket of whatever he wears, cool to the touch, easy to hold, heavy enough to matter. And on nights when the air goes too quiet, he looks toward the part of town where concrete lies like a lid, and he counts to 10 very slowly, the way a person might count steps in the dark. He keeps counting until morning touches the windows. He keeps counting until the house inside him stays locked. He keeps counting until the world answers with nothing at all.